Imagine inheriting a locked briefcase from your grandfather, a veteran who never spoke about the war. Inside, a photograph, a set of coordinates, and a name that doesn't appear in any official record. That briefcase exists. Thousands of them do. For decades, certain chapters of World War II were quietly shelved, not because they were unimportant, but because someone, somewhere, decided the world wasn't ready to know. Tonight, we crack a few of those cases open. Stay with us. This is where history gets uncomfortable. Somewhere beneath the gray surface of the North Atlantic, in the spring of 1945, a German submarine was running out of time. The war in Europe was collapsing, Berlin was burning, and yet U-234, one of the largest submarines the Third Reich ever built, was not retreating. It was departing, quietly, deliberately, loaded with cargo so sensitive that its full manifest would confuse and unsettle researchers for decades to come. The submarine had left Kiel Harbor on the 25th of March, 1945. Its destination, Japan. Its official purpose, to deliver advanced German technology to an ally who was running out of options on the other side of the world. On the surface, this was wartime logistics, a transaction between desperate partners. But the cargo tells a different story. Among the documented contents of U-234 were blueprints for advanced jet aircraft, technical drawings for radar systems, and crates of precision instruments that Japan's engineers had been unable to produce independently. These items alone would have been significant, militarily valuable, worth the risk of a months-long voyage through hostile waters. Then there was the uranium. Roughly 560 kilograms of uranium oxide, loaded into gold-lined cylinders and listed in the manifest with unusual care. The presence of this material, confirmed by post-surrender American records, is one of the most quietly extraordinary details of the late war period. Germany, by most historical accounts, had abandoned serious nuclear weapons development years earlier. So why was this uranium on board? Where had it been stored? And more importantly, where was it going? The official explanation is measured. The uranium was intended for Japanese weapons research, possibly to assist in their own nuclear program, which was far behind the Manhattan Project. Plausible, reasonable even. But the questions don't stop there. When U-234 surrendered to American forces off the coast of Newfoundland in May 1945, its two Japanese officers having taken their own lives rather than face capture, the vessel and its contents were processed quickly and quietly. The uranium was reportedly transferred to the United States. Some historians have speculated, though never conclusively proven, that this very material found its way into the final stages of the Manhattan Project. If that were true, it would mean that the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki contained, in some small measure, uranium that had begun its journey aboard a Nazi submarine. That connection has never been officially confirmed, and the records surrounding the transfer of U-234's cargo remain, in certain respects, incomplete. There are other layers to this story that mainstream accounts tend to gloss over. Among the passengers aboard U-234 were several high-ranking specialists, engineers, scientists, a Luftwaffe general. Men of considerable expertise, traveling at enormous personal risk in the final weeks of a war their side had already lost. What did they know? What were they carrying beyond the manifest? Some researchers have pointed to the possibility that U-234 was part of a broader network of late-war transfers, a last attempt by elements within the Reich to preserve knowledge, technology, and leverage in a post-war world. Others dismiss this as speculation built on incomplete evidence. Both positions are, in their own way, honest. What remains undeniable is this. A submarine left occupied Europe in the dying breath of the Third Reich, carrying uranium and secrets, and surrendered to a nation that was weeks away from changing history forever. Whether that was coincidence, coordination, or something stranger entirely, nobody has ever fully explained. Before moving to the next mystery, if you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. U-234 carried its secrets across an ocean. But some secrets never needed to move at all. Some were buried quietly, in plain sight, in a place so remote and so deliberately obscured that the world would spend decades simply trying to confirm they existed. In the frozen flatlands of northeastern China, in a region then known as Manchuria, there stood during the war years a facility that defied easy description. From a distance, it resembled an industrial complex. Smokestacks, long, low buildings, a self-contained world behind high walls, surrounded by farmland that kept curious locals at a comfortable distance. The nearest major city was Harbin. The facility itself was known to those who worked there, simply by a number. Unit 731. To the outside world, it was registered as a water purification and epidemic prevention unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. A medical facility. Unglamorous, functional, forgettable. That was entirely the point. What happened inside those walls between 1936 and 1945 is, in broad terms, no longer a mystery. Decades of testimony, partial documentation, and investigative journalism have established the essential outline. Unit 731 was one of the most sophisticated biological and chemical weapons research programs in human history, conducted not on animals, not on simulations, but on living human beings. Prisoners of war, civilians, men, women, and children who were referred to in internal documents not by name, but by the Japanese word maruta, meaning logs. The scale was extraordinary. Thousands died within the facility's walls. The research covered plague, cholera, typhoid, frostbite, vivisection, pressure experiments, and weapons delivery systems designed to spread disease across entire populations. By any measure, it was among the darkest chapters of the 20th century. And yet, what happened to the records? When Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, the commander of Unit 731, General Shiro Ishii, ordered the facility destroyed. Buildings were demolished, animals were released or killed, and the documentation, years of meticulous methodical research notes, experimental logs, photographic records, was, according to the official account, burned. Mostly burned. Here is where the history becomes uncomfortable in a different way. In the months following Japan's surrender, American intelligence officers made contact with Ishii and his senior researchers. What followed was a negotiation, quiet, transactional, and deeply troubling in its implications. The United States government, in the early assessment of its own investigators, determined that the biological warfare data gathered by Unit 731 was, in their words, of great value. Data that could not be obtained through ethical experimentation. Data that would take years to replicate. In exchange for immunity from war crimes prosecution, Ishii and key members of his team handed over research findings to American authorities. The deal was kept secret for decades. None of the senior figures of Unit 731 stood trial at Tokyo. Ishii died in 1959 in his own home of throat cancer. The official justification, when this arrangement eventually came to light, was strategic. The Cold War was beginning, biological warfare was a genuine concern, and the data was considered too valuable to ignore. Whether one accepts that reasoning or not, the consequence is clear. The full archive of Unit 731's research was never made public. Much of what was handed over remains classified or has been acknowledged only in the vaguest terms. Which raises the question that historians have never fully resolved. How much of the archive actually survived? The burned records explanation has always sat uneasily with researchers. Unit 731 was not a careless operation. It was meticulous, obsessive even, in its record-keeping. The idea that years of research, cross-referenced, cataloged, and considered militarily invaluable, was simply set alight in a matter of days, strains credibility for many who have studied the facility closely. Some investigators have suggested that significant portions of the archive were dispersed rather than destroyed. copied and carried out through multiple channels, in the same way that German scientific and technical knowledge was being quietly extracted from Europe during the same weeks. There are accounts, unverified, fragmentary, of documents moved through diplomatic pouches, through private intermediaries, through channels that bypassed formal military surrender protocols entirely. Others have pointed to Japan itself. In the decades following the war, Japanese government archives related to Unit 731 were repeatedly cited as incomplete, missing, or simply unavailable for independent review. As recently as the 2000s, construction work in Tokyo unearthed human remains near the site of a former Imperial Army medical school, remains that were quietly reinterred without full forensic investigation. The Japanese government acknowledged the bones were likely connected to wartime medical research. No further official inquiry followed. What does that silence mean? It is difficult to say with certainty. What is known is this: the researchers of Unit 731 were not amateurs operating outside the knowledge of their government. They were funded, directed, and protected at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese military structure. The research they conducted was intended to be used, and in some cases was used, in active military operations in China. This was not a rogue program. It was a sanctioned one, and sanctioned programs leave paper trails. Somewhere, in an archive that has not been fully opened, in a collection that has not been fully cataloged, or in a private holding that has never been disclosed, there may be a more complete record of what happened in Manchuria between 1936 and 1945. A record of names, of experiments, of decisions made at levels of command that official history has never fully reached. Whether that record still exists and whether it will ever surface remains one of the genuinely open questions of 20th century history. Not because the broad facts are disputed, but because the full truth, the names, the orders, the chain of decisions that made it all possible, has never, not completely, been told. Some secrets were buried in paper. Others were buried in ice, in ash, in the carefully managed silence of governments that had every reason to look away. But some secrets were buried in something far more literal. At the bottom of the Skagerrak Strait, the cold, gray stretch of water that separates Denmark from the southern coast of Norway, there lies a submarine. It has been there since May 1945. It was located by Danish researchers in 2008 using sonar equipment, resting at a depth of approximately 123 meters. The wreck is real. Its identity is not seriously disputed. What is disputed, what has never been fully resolved, is what it was carrying when it went down. U-3523 was not an ordinary submarine. It belonged to the type Fonny 1 class, the most advanced underwater vessel the Third Reich had produced. Faster than anything the Allies had deployed, capable of remaining submerged for extraordinary lengths of time, designed not for the war that Germany was already losing, but for a war that its engineers had imagined winning. By the time U-3523 was commissioned, that war was already over in everything but name. The submarine was sunk on the 6th of May, 1945, 2 days before Germany's formal unconditional surrender. It was struck by a British aircraft, a Liberator bomber operating out of Scotland, while running on the surface of the Skagerrak. The attack was swift. The submarine went down quickly, with the loss of almost all hands. Only 3 or 4 survivors were recovered. The official record is thin, as it often is in the final chaotic days of a collapsing war. But the question that has lingered for decades is a simple one. Where was U-3523 going? The type Farwell's submarines were long-range vessels, capable in theory of reaching South America without resurfacing. In the final weeks of the war, several German submarines made precisely that kind of journey, disappearing into the South Atlantic, carrying passengers and cargo that were never fully accounted for. The so-called Rattenlinie, or rat lines, were already functioning. Escape networks, some operated with the knowledge of sympathetic governments and institutions, were moving wanted men and their assets out of Europe through multiple channels. U-3523 was heading north, into the Skagerrak, away from the advancing Allied forces, away from Germany, in a direction that, depending on one's interpretation, either makes perfect navigational sense for a submarine attempting to break into open ocean, or raises questions about its intended route. Danish naval historians have noted that the submarine's course was consistent with a vessel attempting to reach the North Atlantic. From there, the ocean opens in every direction. The wreck, when examined by sonar, appears largely intact. The hull has not been significantly disturbed by time or salvage. What this means, practically, is that whatever U-3523 was carrying when it was struck, it is almost certainly still there, sealed inside a steel hull at the bottom of a cold northern sea. No government has funded a full excavation. That fact alone has attracted attention from researchers who believe the submarine's cargo may be more significant than official accounts suggest. In the final weeks of the war, there was a well-documented pattern of frantic asset transfer within the Reich. Gold reserves, artworks, documents, currency. The physical wealth of a regime that had looted an entire continent was being moved, hidden, and dispersed through channels that historians are still mapping today. Several researchers have suggested that U-3523 may have been part of this transfer, that its cargo was not military in nature, but financial or archival, that the submarine's final voyage was not a combat mission at all, but an extraction, carrying valuables or people, or both, away from a Europe that was about to demand a reckoning. There is no documentary proof of this. The submarine's loading manifest, if one was ever created, has not surfaced in any archive. The identities of everyone aboard have never been fully established. The survivors, if they were ever formally debriefed, left no accessible record of what they carried or where they were instructed to go. What makes U-3523 particularly interesting to those who study the period is its timing. The 6th of May, 1945. Germany would surrender in less than 48 hours. Any military rationale for a combat patrol in the Skagerrak at that precise moment is difficult to construct. The war was, for all practical purposes, finished. Orders were dissolving. Chains of command were fragmenting by the hour. And yet this submarine was moving. Purposefully. On the surface, which made it faster but visible, a calculated risk, perhaps, taken by a crew that believed speed mattered more than concealment. That reaching open water quickly was worth the exposure. Why the urgency, if the mission was routine? The wreck sits in Danish territorial waters. Access requires coordination with Danish maritime authorities, and any serious salvage operation would be expensive, technically demanding, and, depending on what was found, potentially diplomatically complicated. These are not insurmountable obstacles. They are, however, obstacles that have remained in place for decades, without serious effort to clear them. Perhaps there is nothing remarkable inside U-3523. Perhaps it was simply a submarine, running from a war it had already lost, caught on the surface by a routine patrol and sent to the bottom with its crew and its unremarkable cargo. Perhaps, but in a conflict defined by deliberate concealment, by burned records, sealed agreements, and secrets traded quietly between governments, the submarines that moved in the final hours tend to tell the most interesting stories. And this one hasn't been opened yet. U-3523 lies sealed at the bottom of a cold northern sea, its secrets preserved by depth and silence and the quiet indifference of governments with other priorities. But not every mystery from the final days of the Third Reich sank beneath the waves. Some were buried in the earth, hidden in places that were chosen carefully, deliberately, by people who fully intended to come back for them. South of Prague, where the Vltava River narrows and the forested hills of Bohemia close in around the water, there is a village called Stechovice. It is a quiet place, unremarkable by most measures, the kind of village that history passes through without stopping, except that history did stop here. Briefly, urgently, in the final weeks of April 1945, as Soviet forces pushed westward and American forces advanced from the other direction, the German occupation of Czechoslovakia was entering its final, frantic chapter. What followed in those weeks was something that historians have documented across dozens of locations throughout occupied Europe. a desperate, large-scale attempt to make things disappear. Documents, valuables, evidence, the physical residue of 6 years of occupation, looting, and administration that its architects knew would soon face scrutiny. In the Stechovice area, according to accounts that emerged in the years following the war, a significant cache of materials was concealed. The stories vary in their specifics, as such accounts often do when they filter through layers of rumor, Soviet-era secrecy, and incomplete investigation. But the consistent thread running through them is this. Somewhere in the hills and riverbanks around Stechovice, the retreating German forces buried something substantial. Something worth hiding carefully, something they expected to recover. What exactly was buried is the question that has driven searchers, researchers, and governments to this quiet stretch of Bohemia for the better part of 8 decades. The most widely documented accounts speak of SS files, not ordinary administrative paperwork, but operational records, documents relating to intelligence networks, informant lists, details of covert operations conducted throughout occupied Europe. Records that, in the wrong hands, could expose collaborators, compromise post-war networks, and unravel carefully constructed cover stories. For an intelligence apparatus that was already thinking beyond defeat, toward survival and reconstitution, the protection of such documents would have been a serious priority. But the accounts don't stop at files. Other testimonies, some given to Czechoslovak investigators, some emerging decades later through defectors and researchers, speak of gold, currency, looted valuables that had passed through the machinery of occupation and were now being moved out of reach of post-war accounting. The Third Reich had spent years systematically stripping occupied territories of their financial and cultural assets. By 1945, the question of where those assets had gone was already becoming one of the most complex forensic challenges in modern history. Stechovice, in this reading, was one node in a much larger network of concealment. Then there is a third category of material mentioned in certain accounts, and it is perhaps the most intriguing of all: weapons technology. Blueprints, prototypes, or documentation relating to advanced German engineering programs that the Reich survivors would have considered enormously valuable in a post-war world divided between competing superpowers. The same category of material that had filled the hold of U-234, that had stocked the archives of facilities across Germany and Austria. Some of it, according to these accounts, had found its way to Stechovice. Czechoslovak authorities investigated the site multiple times in the decades following the war. Soviet intelligence reportedly conducted its own searches during the occupation period. In the 1990s, following the end of communist rule, renewed interest brought fresh investigators and more sophisticated equipment to the area. Ground-penetrating radar, archival research in newly opened files, interviews with elderly locals whose parents or grandparents had witnessed the wartime activity firsthand. Nothing conclusive has ever been found. Or more precisely, nothing has been publicly confirmed as found. That distinction matters. The Stechovice investigation has a complicated history of official silence, interrupted inquiries, and results that were classified rather than published. A Czech investigator named Jaroslav Mariš spent years researching the hoard and concluded that significant materials were almost certainly buried in the area, and that at least some of what was hidden may have been quietly recovered, not by post-war authorities, but by former SS networks operating through intermediaries in the years immediately after the war, acting, in other words, on information that only the people who buried the cache would have possessed. If that is true, it suggests something unsettling, that the hoard was not simply lost, that it was retrieved by the people who hid it and moved elsewhere, into private hands, into post-war networks, into the long, complicated afterlife of an organization that had planned, with considerable sophistication, for its own survival. The alternative, that the materials are still there, undisturbed, waiting beneath the Bohemian hills, is in some ways harder to accept. 8 decades is a long time. The technology for locating buried materials has advanced enormously. If something significant remained in the ground around Stechovice, the argument goes, it would have been found by now. And yet the searches continue. Quietly, periodically, without the fanfare of official programs or the resources that the question arguably deserves. Because the people who know this period best, the archivists, the forensic historians, the researchers who have spent careers piecing together the final movements of the Reich's apparatus, tend to agree on one thing. The concealment operations of April and May 1945 were not improvised. They were planned, coordinated, executed by people who understood exactly what they were hiding and exactly why it needed to stay hidden, which means that somewhere, almost certainly, it still is. The hills around Stechovice hold their secrets in soil and silence. But further west, deeper into the heart of a crumbling Reich, the concealment took a different form entirely. Not buried caskets or hidden files, but something far more ambitious. Something that required thousands of hands, months of construction, and a level of institutional secrecy so absolute that even today, historians cannot agree on what it was actually built to do. In the forested valley of the Jonastal, in the German state of Thuringia, there is a tunnel complex. It runs beneath the hills in long, deliberate passages, reinforced, engineered, constructed with the kind of precision that does not happen accidentally. The locals have known about it for decades. The German government acknowledges its existence. And yet the full purpose of what was built here in the final years of the Third Reich remains one of the most genuinely contested questions of the late war period. The project was known in official Nazi documentation as Anlage Olga. Construction began in late 1944, carried out under conditions of extreme secrecy by forced laborers drawn from the nearby concentration camp network, primarily from a sub-camp of Buchenwald, which itself sits only a short distance away in the same Thuringian landscape. Thousands of prisoners worked on the Jonastal complex. A significant number died there. As with so many construction projects of the Reich's final years, the human cost was considered irrelevant against the urgency of the work. What the work was for, however, is where the certainty begins to dissolve. The most conservative historical assessment is that Jonastal was intended as the Führer Hauptquartier, Hitler's final command headquarters. A fortified redoubt from which the last stages of the war could be directed, shielded from Allied bombing, buried deep enough in the Thuringian hills to survive whatever came from the air. By late 1944, the original Wolf's Lair in East Prussia was no longer tenable. A new command center, further west, further underground, made strategic sense within the logic of a regime that still believed, or claimed to believe, in ultimate victory. This explanation is reasonable. It is supported by partial documentation, and it may even be partially correct. But it does not account for everything that researchers have found, or more precisely, everything they have failed to find. The tunnel complex at Jonastal is large, considerably larger by most estimates than a command headquarters alone would require. The infrastructure suggests not merely accommodation and communications facilities, but something more industrial in character. Power generation capacity beyond what administration would demand. Ventilation systems of a specification associated with manufacturing rather than habitation. Spatial arrangements that do not map neatly onto the known layouts of other Nazi command facilities. What was being made here, or what was intended to be made here, is a question that has occupied researchers for decades. Some historians have proposed that Jonastal was intended to house relocated weapons production, part of the broader Nazi program of moving critical industry underground as Allied bombing devastated surface facilities. By 1944, German engineers had become extraordinarily sophisticated at constructing subterranean factories. Jet engines, rocket components, and sensitive electronics were already being produced in tunnel complexes elsewhere in the Reich. Jonastal in this reading was simply another node in that network. Others have gone further. The proximity of Jonastal to the broader Thuringian research corridor, a region that housed several advanced weapons development programs, including facilities associated with Germany's nuclear and unconventional weapons research, has led some investigators to suggest that the complex was intended for something more sensitive than conventional manufacturing. The exact nature of that research and how far it had progressed before the war's end remains unclear. Then there is the matter of what happened when American forces arrived. Thuringia was liberated by American troops in April 1945. The Jonastal complex, still incomplete, was among the facilities they encountered. What the Americans found there, and what they chose to do with it, is documented only in fragments. Some accounts describe a rapid and thorough removal of materials and personnel before the formal handover of the region to Soviet control, which occurred in July 1945 as part of the post-war occupation agreements. Thuringia fell within the Soviet zone, and American forces, aware of this, allegedly conducted an intensive extraction operation in the weeks between liberation and withdrawal. What was extracted specifically from Jonastal during that window has never been fully disclosed. Soviet authorities, who subsequently controlled the region for decades, conducted their own investigations into the complex. Whatever they found or concluded was folded into the classified archives of an intelligence apparatus that has never been fully opened. East German authorities periodically restricted access to the Jonastal area during the Cold War period, citing safety concerns related to unstable tunnel structures. Whether those concerns were genuine, precautionary, or something more deliberate is a question that researchers have asked without receiving a satisfying answer. Since German reunification, the site has attracted sustained attention from historians, archaeologists, and independent investigators. Ground surveys have confirmed the extent of the tunnel network. Some sections have been partially explored. Others remain sealed, either by deliberate post-war action or by structural collapse that may or may not have been engineered. What lies in the sealed sections is unknown. It is possible, even likely, that the answer is mundane. Unfinished construction, empty chambers, the physical remnant of an ambition that outran the war that funded it. The Reich's final months were full of projects that were begun in desperation and abandoned in defeat, leaving behind infrastructure that suggested grand purpose but contained nothing of lasting significance. But Jonastal sits in a region dense with confirmed advanced research. It was built by a regime that compartmentalized obsessively, that buried its most important work deepest, and that spent its final weeks moving rather than destroying what it considered most valuable. The tunnels are still there. Most of them have never been fully mapped, and the question of what they were truly built to hold has never, not to anyone's full satisfaction, been answered. The tunnels of Jonastal remain largely sealed, their purpose debated, their contents unknown. But the concealment operations of the Third Reich's final weeks were not limited to what could be buried underground or locked behind reinforced doors. Some of what needed to disappear was loaded onto ships, moved through water under the cover of wartime chaos toward destinations that were never entered into any official record. In the cold waters of the Baltic Sea, not far from the Polish coast, there lies another wreck. Another vessel that went down in the final convulsions of the war, carrying cargo that has never been fully accounted for. Its name was the Karlsruhe. Not the famous German cruiser of the First World War, but a smaller vessel, a civilian ferry that had been pressed into military service, as so many ships were in those desperate final months, to assist with the massive evacuation of German forces and civilians from the collapsing Eastern Front. The Karlsruhe was sunk on the 13th of April, 1945. Attacked by Soviet aircraft while crossing the Baltic, it went down in relatively shallow water near the island of Bornholm. The loss of life was significant. The wreck settled on the seabed in conditions that, unlike the deep cold of the Skagerrak, were accessible, at least in theory, to divers and salvage operations in the decades that followed. And here the story becomes interesting, because when Polish divers located and began examining the Karlsruhe wreck in the early 2020s, what they found did not match the profile of a routine evacuation vessel. Among the debris and the cargo containers still visible within and around the wreck, the divers reported finding crates. Carefully packed, deliberately loaded crates of a kind associated not with the transport of refugees or retreating soldiers, but with the movement of valuables. The question of what those crates contained, and whether their contents remain on the seabed or were recovered long before the Polish team arrived, is one that researchers are still working to answer. The broader context is essential here. The spring of 1945 saw one of the largest maritime evacuations in history as German forces and civilians fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance. Operation Hannibal, as it was formally designated, moved hundreds of thousands of people across the Baltic in a matter of weeks. It was chaotic, dangerous, and conducted under constant threat from Soviet air and naval forces. Ships were sunk regularly. Many of those ships were carrying more than their passenger manifests suggested. The city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, is central to understanding why the Karlsruhe matters. Königsberg was the capital of East Prussia, one of the most historically and culturally significant cities in the German world. Its museums, its institutions, and its private collections represented centuries of accumulated wealth and cultural heritage. As Soviet forces closed in, the evacuation of those collections became a priority for German authorities who understood correctly that what remained behind would not survive the conquest intact. Among the items known to have been evacuated from Königsberg, or believed to have been based on fragmentary records, were contents from the city's museums and administrative buildings. Artworks, archival materials, items of institutional and historical significance that were loaded onto ships in the final weeks before the city fell, and then, in many cases, simply vanished. The most famous missing object associated with Königsberg is the Amber Room, the extraordinary gilded chamber that had been removed from a Russian imperial palace, installed in Königsberg Castle, and then disappeared entirely as the war ended. Its fate remains unknown, and it has attracted more investigative attention than perhaps any other missing artifact of the Second World War. But the Amber Room, for all its fame, was only the most visible item in a much longer inventory of missing Königsberg treasures. Some of those items, researchers believe, were loaded onto ships like the Karlsruhe. The Polish diving team that examined the wreck in recent years has been careful and methodical in its public statements. The crates they identified have not been opened. Their contents have not been confirmed. The investigation is ongoing, and the Polish authorities have been appropriately cautious about drawing conclusions from visual evidence alone. What the divers have said publicly is that the cargo profile of the Karlsruhe does not appear consistent with a standard evacuation vessel, that the arrangement and nature of the loaded materials suggests something more deliberate than the hasty embarkation of refugees. Beyond the question of cultural treasures, some researchers have raised the possibility that the Karlsruhe was also carrying documentary materials, files, records, the kind of administrative and intelligence paperwork that, as we have seen repeatedly in this story, the Reich's various agencies were desperately trying to move, hide, or destroy in those final weeks. Königsberg had been a significant administrative center. Its records, if they survived the evacuation, would have been of considerable interest to Soviet intelligence, and of considerable danger to anyone whose name appeared in them. Whether those records went down with the Karlsruhe, or whether they reached their intended destination, is not known. What makes the Karlsruhe case compelling is precisely its accessibility. Unlike U-3523, resting at depth in the Skagerrak, the Karlsruhe lies in water that divers can reach. Unlike the sealed tunnels of Jonastal, its contents are, in principle, recoverable. The mystery here is not one of physical inaccessibility, but of institutional will, of whether the investigation will be resourced, completed, and its findings made fully public. Those are not always the same thing. The crates on the seabed near Bornholm have waited 80 years. Whatever is inside them has been preserved by cold water and darkness, untouched, in a condition that may be remarkably good. The question is not whether the answers are still there. The question is whether anyone will choose to look. The crates on the seabed near Bornholm await a decision. But not every submerged secret requires the machinery of government to remain hidden. Some are protected by something far more effective than institutional reluctance. Some are guarded by the landscape itself. In the Austrian Alps, southeast of Salzburg, there is a lake that seems almost designed for secrecy. Lake Toplitz sits at the end of a narrow valley, surrounded on all sides by steep forested mountains that cut off direct sunlight for much of the day. The water is dark. Unusually, almost unnervingly dark, even by the standards of alpine lakes. The upper layer is cold and oxygenated, but below a certain depth, roughly 20 meters, the water becomes anoxic, devoid of oxygen. A natural preservation chamber in which organic materials that would decay within months in ordinary water can survive, largely intact, for decades. The Nazis knew this. It is not speculation that the SS used Lake Toplitz as a dumping site in the final weeks of the war. It is documented, confirmed by witness accounts, by partial recoveries, and by the Austrian government's own investigative record. What was thrown into those dark waters in April and May of 1945 has been the subject of searches, disputes, and quiet obsession ever since. The most extensively documented recovery came in 1959, when a team funded by a German magazine conducted the first serious organized dive into the lake. What they found, in the anoxic lower depths, was remarkable in its own right, and deeply frustrating in what it implied. Wooden crates, largely intact after 14 years underwater, containing billions of pounds in forged British banknotes. Plates used for their production. The physical infrastructure of Operation Bernhard, the Reich's ambitious and sophisticated program of economic warfare, which had sought to destabilize the British economy by flooding it with counterfeit currency. The forgeries were extraordinary, produced by concentration camp prisoners with specialized skills, forced to work under conditions of absolute secrecy at the Sachsenhausen camp. The notes were of a quality that even Bank of England experts struggled to reliably distinguish from genuine currency. Millions of pounds worth had been circulated through various channels during the war, and the remainder, the plates, the paper stocks, the UN-issued notes, had ended up here, at the bottom of an Austrian lake, thrown in by SS officers who understood that what they were disposing of was evidence of a crime, but also an asset of extraordinary value. The 1959 recovery was significant. It confirmed the lake's role in the Reich's disposal operations. It answered one question with considerable clarity, and it opened a dozen others, because the divers in 1959 did not find only forged currency. They found evidence of multiple disposal operations, different crates, different materials, different time frames. The lake had not been used once, in a single hurried operation. It had been used repeatedly, systematically, by people who returned to it more than once with more than one category of material. What else went in, and whether it has ever come out, is the question that has driven every subsequent investigation. The most persistent theory, supported by a credible body of witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, concerns gold. SS gold, specifically, the accumulated financial reserves of an organization that had spent years extracting wealth from the populations it controlled and the territories it occupied. In the final weeks, as the Reich's administrative structure collapsed, senior SS officers were known to be moving liquid assets through the Alpine region. The so-called Alpine Redoubt, the mythologized last stand in the Austrian and Bavarian mountains, may never have existed as a serious military proposition, but the financial infrastructure surrounding it was real. Money, gold, and foreign currency were being moved, hidden, and in some cases disposed of in ways that their owners intended to reverse once the immediate danger had passed. Lake Toplitz, in this context, was not a graveyard for valuables. It was a temporary vault. Several witnesses who came forward in the decades following the war, former SS personnel, local residents, individuals connected to the Alpine evacuation networks, described seeing crates of a different character than forged currency being brought to the lake. Heavier, handled with greater care, loaded onto boats by men who did not have the manner of people discarding something worthless. None of these accounts has been conclusively verified. None of the gold, if it exists, has been officially recovered. There have been numerous subsequent dives, some authorized, some not. The lake acquired a grim reputation in the 1960s when several unauthorized divers died during unsanctioned searches, leading the Austrian government to restrict access significantly. Official expeditions in subsequent decades, including a notable operation in the 1980s and another in the early 2000s, recovered additional materials, more forged currency, rocket parts, waterlogged documents, but did not find anything that closed the larger question. The lower depths of the lake remain largely unexplored. The anoxic layer that preserves organic materials also creates technical challenges for divers that were, until recently, extremely difficult to overcome. Modern remotely operated vehicles have changed that calculus somewhat, but a comprehensive, fully resourced survey of the lake's deepest sections has never been completed. Part of the difficulty is jurisdictional and political. The lake sits on private land. Access has historically been controlled by its owners, and the Austrian government's relationship with the site's wartime history has not always been characterized by urgency. These are not unusual obstacles in the context of Second World War investigations. They are, however, obstacles that have remained conveniently in place for a very long time. The dark water of Lake Toplitz holds whatever it holds with extraordinary patience. The preservation conditions that made it attractive to the SS in 1945 are still functioning today. Whatever entered that anoxic layer 8 decades ago is, in all likelihood, still there, still intact, still waiting in the cold and permanent darkness below the reach of sunlight. Whether it is forged currency, or gold, or something else entirely, the lake has not yet finished with its secrets. Lake Toplitz guards its secrets beneath dark water and restrictive legislation and the quiet patience of an anoxic layer that does not yield without considerable effort. But not every mystery from the Reich's final hours is defined by what was hidden in a rush. Some were the product of years of deliberate, methodical accumulation, built slowly, purposefully, in a place that was itself constructed to mean something, to embody something, to serve a purpose that went far beyond the administrative or the military. In the hills of the Teutoburg Forest, in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia, there stands a castle that is unlike any other structure associated with the Third Reich. Wewelsburg is triangular, an unusual form, almost unique among German castles, that lends it an immediately distinctive silhouette against the forested landscape. It dates in its current form to the early 17th century, though its foundations are considerably older. For most of its history, it was unremarkable. A regional curiosity, the kind of place that appears in local histories without attracting wider attention. Then Heinrich Himmler found it. In 1934, the head of the SS leased Wewelsburg from the local district authority for the nominal sum of 1 Reichsmark per year. What followed was a transformation that consumed enormous resources, required the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners, and resulted in a structure that served a function for which there is no straightforward institutional parallel in modern history. Himmler intended Wewelsburg to be the spiritual and ideological center of the SS. Not a headquarters in the administrative sense. The SS had those elsewhere, but something closer to a sacred site. A place of ritual, of initiation, of the particular blend of pseudo-historical mysticism and racial ideology that Himmler cultivated with an obsessive and genuine personal conviction that many of his contemporaries found embarrassing, even within the Reich's leadership. The North Tower was the centerpiece of this vision. Its ground floor contained a circular chamber, the so-called Obergruppenführersaal, or General's Hall, with a central installation in the marble floor that has since become one of the more recognized symbols of SS iconography. Above it, an upper chamber was designed as a kind of memorial crypt. The precise rituals, if any, that took place in these rooms were known only to those who participated in them, and they have never been fully documented. What is documented is the archive. Over the years of SS occupation, Wewelsburg accumulated a substantial collection of materials, research files relating to Germanic history, mythology, and archaeology, documents connected to the Ahnenerbe, the SS research division that sent expeditions to Tibet, to Scandinavia, to the Middle East, pursuing evidence for the ideological framework that underpinned the Reich's racial theories. Correspondence between Himmler and figures in the occult and esoteric communities of Europe, some of whom served as advisors, researchers, or simply as sources of ideas that fed the castle's particular intellectual atmosphere. There were also, according to accounts that emerged after the war, operational documents, records of SS personnel, activities, and internal proceedings that were maintained at Wewelsburg as a secondary or parallel archive to the main SS administrative records held elsewhere. In March 1945, as American forces advanced and the end became undeniable, Himmler ordered Wewelsburg destroyed. An SS detachment attempted to demolish the castle. They succeeded partially. Significant portions of the interior were burned or damaged, before departing hastily as Allied forces approached. The castle survived, structurally, though scarred. The archive did not survive, or rather, it did not remain. What burned and what was removed in those final days is a question that German historians and archivists have been working to reconstruct for decades. The destruction was not total. Fragments of documentation were recovered from the castle and its surroundings after the war. Enough to confirm the nature and approximate scope of what had been held there. Not enough to account for all of it. The Ahnenerbe files are a particular focus of ongoing interest. The SS Research Division conducted dozens of expeditions and research programs during the war years, some of mundane scholarly character, others touching on weapons research, archaeological looting, and intelligence operations conducted under academic cover. The full records of those activities have never been assembled in any single archive. Portions are held in various national collections, in Germany, in Russia, in collections that passed through American and British hands after the war. Other portions have simply never surfaced. Some researchers believe that the most sensitive Wewelsburg materials were removed before the destruction order was carried out, that the burning was selective, intended to eliminate certain categories of documentation while preserving others for transport. The same pattern, in other words, that appears repeatedly in the Reich's final weeks. Destruction as theater, concealing a more careful and deliberate removal of what was considered worth keeping. The question of where those materials went, if they were indeed removed, connects Wewelsburg to the broader network of post-war SS survival operations. The castle had served as a node in Himmler's personal empire, an empire that had its own financial reserves, its own communication channels, its own personnel networks that extended across occupied Europe. When that empire collapsed, the people who had maintained it did not all simply surrender. Some of them disappeared into the ratlines, into new identities, into the post-war world carrying whatever they had managed to take with them. What a senior SS officer departing Wewelsburg in March 1945 might have considered worth carrying is an open question. Leverage, perhaps. Names. Records of transactions, of agreements, of activities that the post-war world would find deeply uncomfortable. The currency of survival in a world that was about to demand accountability. The castle today is a museum. Thoughtful, serious, committed to honest historical engagement with what happened there. Its permanent exhibition draws researchers and visitors from across the world. But the archive that once filled its rooms has never been fully reconstructed, and the question of what left those walls before the flames reached them remains, like so much else from those final weeks, unanswered. Wewelsburg's archive departed in fragments. Some burned, some carried, some absorbed into collections that have never been fully opened. It was not an isolated event. Across the occupied territories, in the final weeks of the Reich, the same pattern repeated itself with striking consistency. Castles, fortresses, and grand estates had served throughout the war as repositories for materials too sensitive, too valuable, or too dangerous to keep in cities that were being bombed into rubble. And as the end approached, those same buildings became the staging points for one final, desperate act of concealment. Further east, in what is now southwestern Poland, one of those buildings still stands, and it still holds questions that no investigation has fully resolved. Książ Castle rises from a forested ridge above the Płotnica River Valley in Lower Silesia, a region that was, until 1945, the German province of Niederschlesien. It is an enormous structure, one of the largest castles in Poland, a layered accumulation of architectural periods that speaks to centuries of continuous habitation and continuous, reinvention. Its walls are thick, its cellars are deep, and beneath it, as beneath so much of the landscape in this part of Lower Silesia, there are tunnels. The tunnels are the starting point for understanding what happened at Książ during the war. Beginning in 1943, the SS undertook a significant construction project beneath and around the castle. Forced laborers, prisoners from the nearby concentration camp system, were brought in to excavate, to reinforce, and to build. The project was connected to a broader network of underground construction in Lower Silesia, part of the same ambitious program of subterranean infrastructure that included the tunnel complexes at nearby Ries. A massive, still not fully explained network of excavations in the Owl Mountains that remains one of the most physically imposing and least understood construction projects of the entire war. At Książ specifically, the SS modifications included the partial gutting of the castle's lower floors and the construction of underground passages connecting the structure to the surrounding tunnel network. The official purpose of these modifications, as with so many SS construction projects of the period, was never clearly stated. The laborers who built them were not told what they were for. The documentation that would normally accompany a project of this scale and cost was either never created or has never been found. What is known is that Książ became, during the war years, a significant SS administrative center for the region. Documents were held there. Personnel were stationed there. The castle functioned as a hub within the SS's Lower Silesian operations, connected physically and administratively to the broader infrastructure of occupation that spread across the region. When Soviet forces advanced into Lower Silesia in early 1945, the evacuation of Książ followed the pattern that had by then become familiar. Materials were removed, certain things were destroyed, and certain things, according to accounts that have accumulated over the decades from former staff, local witnesses, and post-war investigators, were hidden. Not removed entirely, but concealed within the castle itself or within the tunnel network beneath it against the possibility of recovery at some future point. What was hidden is the question that researchers keep returning to. The most consistently cited category is documentation. Administrative records of the SS's Lower Silesian operations, records that would have included details of forced labor programs, of asset transfers, of the movement of looted materials through the region. Lower Silesia was a significant transit zone in the Reich's wartime economy. Valuables extracted from occupied Poland, from further east, from the systematic looting operations that accompanied every stage of the German advance, passed through this region in both directions as the war's fortunes shifted. The paperwork that accompanied those movements, if it survived, would represent an extraordinarily detailed record of crimes and transactions that have never been fully accounted for. Beyond documentation, the accounts speak of physical valuables. Lower Silesia was the destination for numerous evacuation transports from further east in the final war years. Art collections, institutional treasures, private assets seized from populations that had been displaced or destroyed. Some of what arrived in the region was subsequently moved westward as the Soviet advance continued. Some of it, researchers believe, was never moved at all. The tunnel network beneath Książ has been partially explored. Polish investigators and archaeologists have worked on the site at various points since the war, and interest has intensified in recent decades as both the technology for subsurface investigation and the archival access to relevant documentation have improved. What the investigations have confirmed is the extent and sophistication of the underground construction, a network considerably more elaborate than a simple utility installation would require. What they have not found, at least not publicly, is definitive evidence of the specific materials that witnesses and secondary accounts suggest were concealed there. That absence of confirmation is not the same as absence of evidence. The tunnel network is large, and significant sections have never been fully accessed. Structural instability, whether natural or deliberately engineered, has limited exploration in certain areas. The question of whether that instability is incidental or intentional is one that investigators have raised without being able to answer. There is also the question of prior recovery. Lower Silesia came under Soviet control in 1945 and remained within the Soviet sphere throughout the Cold War as part of Poland. Soviet and subsequently Polish security services had both the access and the motivation to conduct their own investigations of the Książ tunnel network in the decades following the war. What those investigations found, if they were conducted, has not been made fully public. The castle today is open to visitors. Its history is presented with care and considerable honesty about the wartime period. The tunnels in the sections accessible to the public are a striking reminder of the scale of what was built beneath this landscape and at what human cost. But the sections that remain sealed are not open to visitors. And the records that were brought to Książ in those final desperate weeks, if they are still here, if they survived, if they were not removed by hands that left no trace in any archive, have not yet announced themselves. The sealed tunnels beneath Książ Castle hold whatever they hold in patient darkness, their contents protected by instability and institutional reluctance, and the slow accumulation of unanswered questions. But Lower Silesia was not the only place where the Reich's final evacuation left unresolved traces. The same Baltic waters that swallowed U-3523 witnessed, in the winter of 1945, a maritime disaster so vast in its human dimensions that the question of what else was lost alongside the lives has taken decades simply to be asked clearly. On the night of the 30th of January 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff left the port of Guttenhafen, now the Polish city of Gdynia, and sailed into the freezing darkness of the Baltic Sea. It did not reach its destination. Shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, a Soviet submarine, S-13, fired 3 torpedoes into the vessel. The ship sank in less than an hour. The water temperature was close to freezing. The lifeboats were inadequate, frozen to their davits, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe unfolding around them. The death toll has never been established with complete precision. The most widely accepted estimates place it between 8,000 and 9,000 people. By any measure, it remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters in recorded history, surpassing the Titanic many times over in human cost, and yet occupying a far smaller space in the popular historical consciousness, in part because it occurred in the closing chaos of a war that was producing catastrophe on an almost incomprehensible scale. The Wilhelm Gustloff had begun its life as a cruise ship. Built in the late 1930s as a vessel for the Nazi leisure organization Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, it was designed to carry ordinary German workers on affordable holidays, a floating symbol of the Reich's social program. By 1945, that world was unrecognizable. The ship had served as a hospital vessel, as a floating barracks for submarine training personnel, and finally, as an evacuation transport, pressed into the desperate movement of civilians and military personnel away from the advancing Soviet forces. On its final voyage, the Gustloff was carrying a documented passenger list that was itself a matter of considerable chaos. Estimates of those aboard range from 7,000 to 10,000 individuals, reflecting the disorder of an embarkation conducted under extreme pressure, with people boarding through multiple access points without systematic registration. Among the passengers were civilians, wounded soldiers, naval personnel, and a contingent of female naval auxiliaries. What the ship was carrying beyond its human cargo is where the documented history begins to blur. The wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lies in Polish territorial waters at a depth of approximately 44 meters, accessible to divers, protected by Polish law as a war grave, and the subject of periodic official and unofficial investigation since the war's end. What those investigations have found in terms of physical cargo has never been comprehensively disclosed. The Polish government, which has jurisdiction over the site, has conducted surveys and maintained restrictions on access that have generated their own questions over the years. The most persistent theory concerning the Gustloff's cargo centers on the Amber Room. The missing amber chamber from the Catherine Palace near Leningrad, looted by German forces in 1941, transported to Königsberg, and then lost entirely as the war ended, has attracted more investigative attention than perhaps any other missing artifact of the conflict. Königsberg fell to Soviet forces in April 1945, after the Gustloff had already sunk. But the timeline of the Amber Room's disappearance from the castle is not precisely established. Some researchers have proposed that elements of the collection were moved before the siege tightened, evacuated through the Baltic on vessels like the Gustloff before the window closed entirely. No physical evidence has confirmed this theory. The counter-arguments are substantial. The logistics of moving such a fragile and voluminous collection under wartime conditions would have been formidable, and several serious investigations have concluded that the Amber Room more likely remained in Königsberg until the Soviet capture of the city. But the theory persists, in part because the alternative, that the Amber Room was simply destroyed in the final bombardment of Königsberg, has also never been conclusively demonstrated. Beyond the Amber Room, the broader question of what valuables the Gustloff carried connects to the well-documented pattern of Baltic evacuation transports in the winter of 1945. Ships leaving Gottenhafen and Danzig in those weeks were not carrying only human beings. The systematic movement of looted assets from the eastern occupied territories, art, gold, institutional collections, SS operational materials, was using the same maritime routes as the civilian evacuation. In the chaos of those final weeks, the distinction between refugee transport and asset transport had effectively dissolved. Ships carried whatever needed to move, loaded by whoever had the authority and the urgency to put it aboard. Who had that authority on the Gustloff's final voyage, and what they chose to load, is not fully known. The embarkation records that survived are incomplete. The senior personnel aboard who might have been responsible for any significant cargo did not, in most cases, survive to give accounts. The wreck itself remains the most direct potential source of answers. 44 meters is within the range of technical diving, and the preservation conditions in the Baltic, while not as extreme as the anoxic depths of Lake Toplitz, are sufficient to have maintained the structural integrity of the vessel and potentially much of its contents. What systematic investigation of the cargo areas has revealed has not been made comprehensively public. The Wilhelm Gustloff is remembered, rightly and primarily, as a site of enormous human tragedy. The thousands who died in those freezing waters deserve that primacy of remembrance. But ships carry what they carry, and a vessel that departed in the final desperate hours of an empire's collapse, from a port that was simultaneously an evacuation point and an asset transfer hub loaded in conditions of chaos and urgency, may have taken more to the bottom of the Baltic than the official record has yet acknowledged. The Baltic gave up some of its secrets reluctantly, and others not at all. But the pattern we have traced across these stories, of empires in collapse, of valuables loaded onto vessels in the final hours, of ships that sank before they reached their destinations, was not unique to the European theater. On the other side of the world, in the warm and treacherous waters of the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the same story was playing out with its own cast of ships, its own categories of missing cargo, and its own decades of unanswered questions. The Imperial Japanese Empire, at its height, stretched across an enormous arc of territory, from the Chinese mainland to the islands of the Central Pacific, from the Aleutians in the north to the edges of Australia in the south. In the process of building and administering that empire, Japan's military and government accumulated vast quantities of looted wealth: gold, silver, gemstones, cultural artifacts, institutional treasures drawn from the banks and palaces and museums of a dozen conquered nations. The Philippines alone, which had served as a significant financial center for the region, yielded assets on a scale that post-war investigators struggled to fully quantify. Moving that wealth, protecting it, concentrating it, and ultimately attempting to evacuate it as Allied forces dismantled the empire piece by piece, became one of the defining logistical challenges of Japan's final war years. And as with the Reich in Europe, the ships tasked with that movement became, in many cases, the vessels that carried the most enduring mysteries. The Momi Maru is one such vessel. It was not a warship. Like so many of the vessels pressed into service in the final stages of the Pacific War, the Momi Maru was a cargo ship, a working vessel that had spent its operational life moving the ordinary materials of commerce and administration before finding itself, in the later war years, assigned to tasks considerably less ordinary. The precise details of its wartime service record are, in the way of many Japanese merchant vessels from this period, incomplete. Japanese maritime records suffered significant losses both from Allied bombing of administrative centers and from the deliberate destruction of documentation that accompanied the surrender. What is documented is the broad context in which vessels like the Momi Maru operated during the final phase of the Pacific War. By 1944, Japan's maritime supply lines were under sustained and devastating pressure from American submarine operations. The campaign against Japanese shipping was one of the most effective aspects of the Allied Pacific strategy. Methodical, relentless, and ultimately catastrophic for an island empire that depended on sea lanes to sustain both its war effort and its civilian population. Hundreds of Japanese vessels were sunk during this period. Many of them were carrying materials that have never been fully accounted for. The specific interest in the Momi Maru centers on accounts, fragmentary, sourced from post-war testimony and partially declassified intelligence records, suggesting that the vessel was involved in the movement of looted assets from the Philippines during the period of Japanese withdrawal from the archipelago. The Philippines had been under Japanese occupation since early 1942, and in the years that followed, a systematic extraction of the island's financial and material resources had been conducted under the direction of military and administrative authorities whose records are themselves incomplete. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines during the final phase of the occupation, became the central figure in one of the most persistent treasure legends of the entire Pacific War, the so-called Yamashita's Gold, a supposed consolidation of looted Asian wealth buried somewhere in the Philippine archipelago before the Japanese surrender. The legend has attracted treasure hunters, fraudsters, and serious researchers in roughly equal measure for 8 decades, and its factual basis remains genuinely contested. The Momi Maru enters this story as a vessel that, according to certain accounts, was part of the convoy system attempting to move assets out of the Philippines before American forces completed their reconquest of the islands. If those accounts are accurate, the ship was not simply a routine cargo vessel on a routine passage. It was part of a directed operation, carrying materials that the Japanese military considered important enough to prioritize for evacuation under increasingly dangerous conditions. The ship did not complete its journey. It was sunk, the precise circumstances varying somewhat across different accounts, but the fact of its loss not seriously disputed, in waters that have been identified by researchers as lying somewhere in the South China Sea or the approaches to the Philippine archipelago. The exact location of the wreck has not been publicly confirmed. That uncertainty is itself significant. The South China Sea is not an unmapped wilderness. Modern survey technology has located wrecks in far more challenging conditions in recent decades. The absence of a confirmed, publicly acknowledged wreck site for the Momi Maru is either a reflection of genuine uncertainty about the vessel's final position, which, given the chaos of the final Pacific campaign, is entirely plausible, or it is a reflection of something more deliberate. The question of deliberateness is one that surfaces repeatedly in research connected to Japanese wartime asset movements. Unlike the post-war situation in Germany, where Allied occupation authorities had immediate and comprehensive access to German territory and records, Japan's surrender arrangements left considerably more space for the management of sensitive information by Japanese authorities themselves. The purging and reclassification of records relating to wartime looting operations was, according to researchers who have studied the period, conducted with considerable thoroughness in the weeks between the surrender announcement and the arrival of occupation authorities. What survived that process, and in whose hands it survived, is a question that connects the Momi Maru to a broader and still unresolved accounting of Japan's wartime financial operations. Post-war investigations by Allied authorities, including operations conducted under the direction of American intelligence, did establish that significant quantities of looted Asian wealth had been recovered from Japanese sources in the immediate post-war period. The disposition of some of that wealth, how much was recovered, by whom, and what became of it, has been the subject of serious historical scholarship that challenges the official accounting in important respects. The Momi Maru sits within this larger unresolved picture, a vessel that, if the accounts surrounding it are accurate, was carrying materials of considerable value at the moment it was lost. materials that sank with it into waters that have not been systematically searched, in a region where the political and jurisdictional complexities of any serious salvage operation are formidable. The warm waters of the South China Sea preserve their contents differently than the cold depths of the Baltic or the anoxic darkness of an alpine lake. Time, salt water, and the particular conditions of tropical seas work on submerged materials in ways that complicate any assessment of what might remain recoverable. But the cargo, whatever its precise nature, went down with the ship, and the ship, wherever it lies, has not yet been found. The Momi Maru carried its secrets into warm Pacific waters, and they remain there, unlocated, unexamined, part of an accounting that has never been completed. But the movement of looted wealth during the Second World War was not a story told only by the aggressors. As the war ended and the maps of Europe and Asia were redrawn by force, the victors conducted their own operations of extraction. Some openly acknowledged, some conducted in the shadows, and some recorded in documents that have spent the better part of 8 decades locked inside archives that the outside world has never been permitted to examine fully. In the spring and summer of 1945, as Soviet forces swept through Germany and the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, they were followed by units whose purpose had nothing to do with combat. These were the Trophy Brigades, specialized teams operating under the direct authority of Soviet state institutions, tasked with the systematic identification, collection, and removal of cultural, scientific, and material assets from the territories that the Red Army had conquered. The scale of what they removed was extraordinary. Paintings, sculptures, entire museum collections packed into crates and loaded onto trains heading east. Scientific instruments, industrial equipment, technical documentation. Library holdings measured not in volumes, but in tons. Archives, governmental, institutional, personal, gathered from the ruins of cities that had been fought over with devastating thoroughness and stripped with equal thoroughness once the fighting stopped. The Trophy Brigades were not improvised. They were organized, professional, and operating according to directives that came from the highest levels of the Soviet state. Stalin had approved the program. The institutions involved, the major Soviet museums, the State Archive System, the Academy of Sciences, provided personnel who understood what they were looking for and how to assess its significance. This was not random looting. It was a curated, directed transfer of wealth and knowledge on a scale that had few historical precedents. What the Trophy Brigades took has been, for decades, a source of significant diplomatic tension between Russia and the nations from which the materials were removed, most significantly Germany, but also Poland, Hungary, Romania, and others. Some items have been returned after protracted negotiations and considerable political friction. The Pergamon altar treasures, the Trojan gold excavated by Heinrich Schliemann, thousands of artworks now held in Russian state museums. These have been acknowledged, cataloged to varying degrees, and become part of an ongoing and largely unresolved conversation about cultural restitution. But the records of the Trophy Brigades themselves, the operational documentation of what was taken, from where, in what quantities, and transported to which destinations, present a different and in some ways more fundamental problem. Those records exist. They were created methodically by the brigades themselves. Inventories, transfer documents, condition reports, correspondence between field teams and their institutional supervisors in Moscow. The paper trail of one of the largest organized transfers of cultural and material wealth in modern history was generated in real time by the people conducting it, and the majority of that paper trail has never been made available for independent examination. The Russian State Archive System holds the Trophy Brigade records under classifications that have been maintained with varying degrees of rigidity since the Soviet period. Partial access has been granted to Russian researchers at certain points. Limited disclosures have occurred in the context of specific restitution negotiations. A fraction of the material has entered the public domain through various channels over the decades. The bulk of it remains closed. What this means, practically, is that the full accounting of what the Trophy Brigades removed has never been possible. researchers working on the fate of specific collections, a painting missing from a German museum, a library collection that vanished from a Polish institution, an archive that should have survived the war but cannot be located, frequently find themselves unable to determine whether the materials they are seeking were destroyed in the fighting, hidden during the retreat, taken by Western Allied forces, absorbed into private collections, or removed by Soviet trophy brigade operations and transported east. The inability to answer that question, to simply determine where things went, has frustrated restitution efforts, distorted our understanding of cultural losses during the war, and left thousands of families and institutions in a state of perpetual uncertainty about property that was taken from them under conditions of violence and occupation. Beyond the cultural and restitution dimensions, the Trophy Brigade records carry a more unsettling implication for historians of the intelligence and scientific dimensions of the war. Among the materials the brigades collected were not only artworks and library holdings. They also gathered technical documentation, scientific research archives, and intelligence materials from German institutions that the advancing Soviet forces encountered. The intersection between the Trophy Brigade operations and the parallel Soviet effort to extract German scientific and technical expertise, the Soviet equivalent of the American Operation Paperclip, has never been fully mapped, precisely because the records of both programs remain largely classified. What German scientific research the Soviets acquired through Trophy Brigade operations, and how that material influenced Soviet post-war weapons and technology programs, is a question that cannot be answered from the documentation currently available to independent researchers. The outlines can be inferred. The specifics remain opaque. There is also the question of intelligence archives. German security and intelligence services maintained extensive records of informants, of operations, of personnel that would have been of extraordinary value to Soviet intelligence in the immediate post-war period and beyond. Whether Trophy Brigade operations contributed to the Soviet acquisition of such materials, and whether those materials have ever been fully disclosed or accounted for, is something that researchers have raised repeatedly without receiving satisfactory answers. The Trophy Brigade records in this reading are not merely a cultural restitution problem. They are a key to understanding a series of post-war developments in Soviet science, in Cold War intelligence, in the fates of individuals whose names appeared in captured German records, that our current historical understanding addresses only partially. Russia has, at various points, signaled a degree of openness to revisiting the question of Trophy Brigade disclosures. Those signals have not in practice translated into the kind of systematic, independently verifiable access that would allow a proper accounting to be made. The records sit in Moscow, organized, preserved, held in institutions that understand exactly what they contain. The question is not whether the documentation of what was taken still exists. It is whether the full truth of where it went and what it revealed will ever be allowed to surface, or whether that particular archive will remain, like so many others in this story, sealed by the patient weight of institutional silence. The Trophy Brigade records sit in Moscow, classified and patient, their full contents known only to those who maintain the classification. It is a reminder that the mysteries of the Second World War are not all products of destruction or accident. Some were created deliberately by institutions that understood the value of what they held and made a calculated decision to keep it from the world. But institutional silence, however formidable, is a different kind of concealment from the operational secrecy that surrounded the Reich's own asset movements. And as we turn back to the German side of this ledger, we find a story that begins not in the final desperate weeks of collapse, but years earlier. In the open ocean, in the first autumn of the war, aboard a vessel that had no obvious reason to be where it was found. In September 1939, the war was barely weeks old. Poland had fallen. The Western Front was locked in the strange suspended tension of the phony war. And in the South Atlantic, far from any theater of active operations, a German merchant vessel called the SS Minden was intercepted by British naval forces. The circumstances of the interception are, in themselves, unremarkable for the period. British naval patrols were actively pursuing German merchant shipping in the opening months of the war, attempting to strangle the Reich's maritime trade before it could be properly organized for wartime conditions. The Minden was a cargo vessel. Its presence in the South Atlantic was not, on the surface, extraordinary. What was extraordinary was what happened next. As British forces moved to board the vessel, the Minden's crew scuttled the ship. This, too, was not without precedent. German merchant crews had standing orders to deny their vessels to the enemy, and scuttling was a recognized response to imminent capture. But the speed and decisiveness with which the Minden's crew acted, and the particular circumstances of the vessel's position and route, attracted the attention of British naval intelligence in ways that a routine scuttling would not have. The question that British investigators found themselves asking was straightforward. What was the Minden carrying that was worth sinking for? The ship went down in deep water. Whatever it was transporting went with it, and the official record of what British intelligence concluded about the Minden's cargo has never been fully disclosed. What has emerged over the decades, through a combination of archival research, post-war testimony, and investigative journalism, is a picture that remains frustratingly incomplete but consistently suggestive. The Minden, according to accounts that have accumulated from multiple independent sources, was not on a routine commercial voyage. It was operating as part of a support network for German naval operations in the Atlantic. Specifically, it has been suggested, as a resupply and liaison vessel connected to the German surface raider program, which was already being prepared for deployment in the opening phase of the war. But the more striking claim, and the one that has attracted sustained attention from researchers, concerns the nature of the Minden's cargo. Several sources, drawing on different threads of evidence, have suggested that the vessel was carrying gold. Not in trivial quantities, but in amounts significant enough to constitute a strategic transfer. Gold that was being moved in the very opening weeks of the war, through channels that bypassed the normal financial mechanisms of international trade. The context for this claim requires some explanation. In the months before the war's outbreak, the German government had been conducting a series of financial operations aimed at securing hard currency and precious metal reserves outside the Reich's borders. The Nazi regime was acutely aware of the financial constraints that had crippled Germany in the First World War, and significant efforts had been made to pre-position assets in ways that would sustain the war economy under conditions of blockade. Some of those operations were conducted through legitimate banking channels. Others were considerably less transparent. Whether the Minden was part of this pre-positioning effort, carrying gold that had been moved out of German financial institutions and was being transferred to a location or intermediary that would keep it accessible regardless of how the naval war developed, is a question that the available evidence neither conclusively confirms nor definitively refutes. The British naval intelligence files relating to the Minden interception have been partially released through the National Archives. What they contain is suggestive without being definitive. The assessments written by officers involved in the interception indicate a level of interest in the vessel's cargo that goes beyond what a routine merchant scuttling would generate. The specific conclusions of those assessments, in the portions that have been released, are careful and measured. The portions that remain classified are, by definition, unknown. This pattern, partial release, suggestive fragments, classified remainder, is one that researchers encounter repeatedly when investigating the financial dimensions of the early war period. The movement of gold and hard currency in the months before and immediately after the outbreak of war touched institutions and individuals in neutral countries whose post-war relationships with the Allied powers made full transparency inconvenient. Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Spain. The financial networks that moved money across the boundaries of the conflict involved parties whose cooperation the post-war Western order depended upon, and whose full exposure would have complicated the reconstruction of European stability. In that environment, certain questions were allowed to remain unanswered. Certain files were closed without the thoroughness that the historical record deserved. Whether the Minden falls into this category, whether the true nature of its cargo was known to British intelligence and subsequently managed rather than disclosed, is something that cannot be determined from the currently available record. The wreck itself sits in deep water in the South Atlantic. The coordinates of its sinking have been approximated from the records of the interception, but no serious effort to locate or survey the wreck has been publicly undertaken. At the depth it likely rests, recovery would be technically demanding and expensive. The question of who would fund such an operation and what their motivation would be is complicated by the absence of clear ownership claims over a vessel whose cargo, if it exists as described, has no straightforward legal heir. The SS Minden is, in some respects, the most tantalizing kind of mystery, one that occurred in plain sight, witnessed by the naval forces of a major power, documented in files that have been partially preserved, and yet still not explained. A ship scuttled in the opening weeks of a world war, in waters far from home, by a crew that moved with a purpose and a speed suggesting they knew exactly what they were protecting. And whatever they were protecting went to the bottom with them. Whether it is still there, or whether it was quietly retrieved by parties whose interest in the matter was never publicly acknowledged, is a question that the South Atlantic has not yet been asked to answer. The SS Minden took its secrets to the floor of the South Atlantic in the first autumn of the war, scuttled by a crew that understood the value of what they were protecting. 5 years later, in the same vast ocean, another vessel met a different but equally consequential end. This one not scuttled by its own crew, but hunted down and destroyed, carrying a cargo that would not be fully understood for decades, resting in water so deep that the world would have to wait half a century before anyone could confirm it was even there. The I-52 was a Japanese submarine, not a standard combat vessel, but a modified transport submarine, one of a small class of large underwater craft designed specifically for long-range cargo missions. Its dimensions were considerable. At over 100 meters in length, it was built to carry substantial quantities of strategic materials across oceanic distances that surface vessels, vulnerable to Allied interdiction, could no longer safely traverse by 1943. The mission it was assigned in the spring of 1944 was one of the most ambitious submarine voyages of the entire war. I-52 would depart from Japan, cross the Indian Ocean, round the Cape of Good Hope, or pass through the Strait of Malacca, cross the South Atlantic, and rendezvous with German forces, delivering Japanese strategic materials to Europe while collecting German technology and expertise for the return journey. The cargo it carried outbound has been documented with reasonable confidence. Among the confirmed or strongly evidenced items were 2 tons of gold, payment for the German technical assistance Japan was seeking, along with tin, rubber, molybdenum, and opium. The gold is the element that has attracted the most sustained attention, for obvious reasons. But the full manifest represented a transfer of strategic value that both nations considered important enough to risk one of their most capable submarines on a journey of some 30,000 kilometers through waters increasingly dominated by Allied forces. The rendezvous with a German U-boat occurred in the South Atlantic in late June 1944. The meeting point, southeast of the Azores, was where German navigators and technical personnel were scheduled to board the I-52 for the return voyage to Japan. The transfer took place. The additional personnel came aboard, and then, within hours, I-52 was gone. American naval forces operating from the escort carrier USS Bogue had been tracking the submarine using a combination of signals intelligence and airborne patrols. The rendezvous point had been compromised. Exactly how, and through which intelligence channel, has been a matter of some historical discussion, though the role of Allied code-breaking and monitoring Axis submarine communications during this period is well established. A torpedo-armed aircraft located I-52 in darkness, using radar, and attacked. The submarine sank in water of approximately 5,000 meters depth, nearly 3 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic. For nearly 5 decades, that was where the story ended. A known loss, a confirmed sinking, a wreck in deep water that was beyond any realistic prospect of investigation. Then, in 1995, an American explorer and deep-sea researcher named Paul Tidwell located the wreck. The discovery confirmed the broad outlines of what was already known: the position, the identity, the general circumstances of the sinking. But it also confronted the question that the discovery of any such wreck inevitably raises. What is still there? At 5,000 meters, the I-52 rests in conditions that have preserved the structural integrity of the vessel to a significant degree. The gold, if it remains aboard, and 2 tons of gold being chemically inert and physically dense, would be among the cargo most likely to have survived 8 decades on the ocean floor, would in theory be recoverable given sufficient resources and technical capability. The practical and legal obstacles to that recovery have proved formidable. Tidwell's expeditions in the 1990s and early 2000s were unable to secure the financial backing necessary for a full salvage operation. The jurisdictional questions surrounding the wreck are complex. It lies in international waters, the vessel is Japanese naval property, and the gold's original provenance, as a state-to-state payment between 2 wartime governments, creates a tangle of ownership claims that has deterred straightforward commercial salvage. Japan has not formally pursued the wreck. The United States, whose military action sent it to the bottom, has no particular legal claim over its contents. The question of who, legally and practically, could authorize and conduct a recovery operation has never been resolved. In the absence of resolution, speculation has developed around the wreck in ways that go beyond the confirmed cargo. Some researchers have raised questions about the personnel who boarded I-52 at the South Atlantic rendezvous. The German technical specialists who transferred from the U-boat to the Japanese submarine were carrying, in addition to themselves, whatever materials and documentation they had been assigned to deliver. The nature of that material, the specific technical knowledge and physical items that Germany was transferring to Japan in mid-1944, has not been comprehensively documented. Given the broader context of German-Japanese technical exchange during this period, which touched on weapon systems, propulsion technology, and material science, the question of what those specialists were carrying is not trivial. There is also the matter of the signal's intelligence dimension. The interception of I-52 was, in intelligence terms, a significant operation. The full record of how American forces tracked and located the submarine, the specific sources, the communication intercepts, the analytical work that placed an aircraft carrier in the right part of the Atlantic at the right moment, has not been completely declassified. In the context of the broader Allied signals intelligence operation, certain aspects of individual intercepts remain protected long after the general fact of code breaking became public knowledge. What the I-52 intercepts revealed beyond the location of the rendezvous, whether they provided information about the submarine's cargo, its contacts, or the broader network of Axis strategic exchange, is something that the available declassified record addresses only partially. The wreck sits in its deep water, largely intact, holding whatever it holds. The gold, if it is there, is worth considerably more at current prices than it was in 1944. The technical documentation, if any, survived the sinking, would be of historical rather than strategic value. The full manifest of what I-52 was carrying when it went down, outbound cargo and inbound expertise combined, has never been reconstructed with complete confidence. 3 miles of cold, dark water separate the surface from whatever answers remain aboard. And the question of whether anyone will ever invest what it takes to close the distance remains, like the wreck itself, suspended in the deep. The I-52 rests in deep Atlantic water, its cargo suspended in the kind of darkness that makes recovery a matter of will as much as technology. Gold sent eastward by Japan, never delivered, never recovered, part of a wartime financial architecture that operated at enormous scale and left enormous gaps in the historical record. But the movement of gold during the Second World War was not exclusively a story of Axis transfers and strategic payments between desperate allies. The democracies, too, moved their wealth under conditions of extreme urgency and extreme secrecy. And in at least one case, the full accounting of what was moved, where it went, and what became of it has never been satisfactorily completed. In the spring and summer of 1940, France was collapsing. The speed of the German advance through the Ardennes and across northern France had shocked even those who had anticipated a German offensive. Within weeks, the strategic situation had moved from concerning to catastrophic. Dunkirk had been evacuated. Paris had been declared an open city. The government was in flight, moving southward ahead of the advancing Wehrmacht, attempting to manage an orderly retreat under conditions that made order almost impossible. In the midst of this collapse, the Banque de France faced a problem of extraordinary urgency. In its vaults, and in the vaults of associated institutions, sat the gold reserves of the French state, one of the largest national gold holdings in the world, accumulated over decades and representing the financial foundation of French sovereignty. Allowing that gold to fall into German hands was, for the officials responsible for its protection, an outcome to be avoided at almost any cost. What followed was one of the most ambitious emergency financial operations in modern history. Between May and July of 1940, the Banque de France organized the movement of its gold reserves out of metropolitan France through a series of convoys that used every available means of transport: rail, road, and ultimately sea. The scale of the operation was remarkable. Hundreds of tons of gold, packed into crates and loaded onto whatever vessels could be requisitioned, were moved from French ports to locations that would place them beyond German reach. Martinique, in the French Caribbean; Dakar, in French West Africa; Canada; the United States. The broad outlines of this operation are documented. French financial historians have reconstructed significant portions of the convoy movements and the gold that reached its intended destinations. Martinique, Dakar, the Federal Reserve in New York, has been accounted for in general terms. Negotiations over the disposition of French gold reserves occupied diplomats and financial officials for years after the liberation, and the records of those negotiations provide a partial map of what went where. Partial, but not complete. The gaps in that map are where the mystery lives. The convoys operated under conditions of enormous stress and imperfect communication. Ships were diverted. Destinations changed as the military situation evolved and as different factions within the fragmenting French government asserted different priorities. The Vichy regime that emerged from the armistice had its own relationship with the gold reserves, some of which remained under its nominal control in French colonial territories, subject to German pressure and American counterpressure in a three-way negotiation that continued for years. The gold that reached Martinique became, during the early war years, one of the most diplomatically sensitive financial questions in the Atlantic world. The United States, increasingly concerned about the possibility of German access to French colonial assets, maintained significant pressure on the Vichy authorities in the Caribbean. The negotiations were complex, prolonged, and not entirely transparent in their resolution. What eventually happened to every ingot of the Martinique gold, how much was transferred to American custody, how much remained in French colonial control, and whether the accounting was ever fully reconciled, has been questioned by researchers who have examined the available records carefully. The Dakar portion of the story carries its own complications. French West Africa became a contested zone as de Gaulle's Free French movement and the Vichy government competed for control of France's colonial empire. The gold held in Dakar was subject to claims from multiple directions, and the sequence of its eventual disposition involved actors and transactions that the official record does not address with complete clarity. But it is in the transit itself, in the journeys between French ports and the destinations to which the gold was directed, that the most enduring questions arise. Several ships involved in the gold convoy operations were lost during the transit period, some to enemy action, some to the hazards of wartime navigation, some under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The question of whether ships carrying gold were among those lost, and if so, whether the gold they carried was ever recovered, or whether it remained somewhere on the seabed, has not been answered with the thoroughness that the scale of the operation would seem to warrant. There are accounts, sourced from port records, crew testimonies, and fragmentary administrative documents of discrepancies between the gold loaded onto certain vessels and the gold recorded as having arrived at its destination. In the chaos of the 1940 collapse, such discrepancies are not in themselves surprising. Record-keeping under those conditions was inevitably imperfect. But imperfect records and genuine losses are not the only explanations for missing gold. In an environment where institutional authority was dissolving and competing factions were asserting control over French state assets, the opportunity for diversion, deliberate, directed, and subsequently concealed, existed in ways that would have been difficult to detect and are now difficult to investigate. Some researchers have pointed to the involvement of private financial intermediaries in certain portions of the convoy arrangements. The urgency of the operation and the collapse of normal institutional channels meant that individuals and entities outside the formal banking structure were involved in ways that left limited paper trails. What those intermediaries handled, and what became of it, is not fully documented in any archive that has been made publicly available. The French gold convoys represent a different kind of wartime financial mystery from the ones we have explored elsewhere in this story. This was not looted wealth, not the proceeds of conquest. It was the legitimate reserve of a sovereign nation, moved in desperation by people trying to protect it from an aggressor. Whether they fully succeeded, whether every ingot that left France in those desperate summer weeks of 1940 was accounted for and reached the hands that were meant to receive it, is a question that the available record cannot yet answer with complete confidence. And in the distance between what was loaded and what was received, there remains a space that no official accounting has ever fully closed. The French gold convoys moved wealth through a collapsing country, through channels that were improvised, pressured, and not always fully recorded. The gaps in that accounting reflect the fundamental disorder of a nation in freefall, records lost to urgency, to institutional collapse, to the simple human impossibility of maintaining perfect documentation in the middle of catastrophe. But not all missing records from the Second World War are products of chaos. Some were missing by design. Some were created with the explicit intention that they would never be found, because the operations they documented depended absolutely on the world not knowing they had ever taken place. In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the English countryside, and then on the roads and fields of liberated France, there moved a military unit unlike anything that had existed before in the history of warfare. It had a designation: the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It had personnel, roughly 1,100 men, drawn from an unusual cross-section of American society. And it had a mission that its members were forbidden, under the strictest possible security classifications, from discussing with anyone outside the unit for decades after the war ended. They were, in the language that history eventually settled on, the Ghost Army. Their purpose was deception, specifically the simulation of military forces far larger than themselves, the creation, through an elaborate and sophisticated combination of technologies and techniques, of the convincing appearance of American army units that did not exist. Inflatable tanks that, from the air or from a distance, were indistinguishable from armored vehicles. Sound trucks that broadcast recordings of tank movements, of troop activity, of the sonic signatures of a major military formation, across distances that carried the illusion miles beyond the unit's actual position. Fake radio traffic, generated by specialists who had studied German signals intelligence methods with sufficient care to make their transmissions convincing to enemy intercept operators. And theatrical elements, uniforms, shoulder patches, conversations conducted loudly in public places near enemy lines, that planted and reinforced the impression of units and commanders and operations that existed only as constructed fiction. The Ghost Army conducted approximately 20 operations between their arrival in France in 1944 and the end of the war in Europe in 1945. The missions varied in scale and complexity, but the consistent purpose was to draw German attention, resources, and military response away from actual American operations. To make the enemy concentrate forces against phantoms while real offensives proceeded elsewhere. By the most conservative assessments, the unit's operations saved thousands of American lives by successfully diverting German forces at critical moments. The men who served in the Ghost Army were, to an unusual degree, artists. Painters, sculptors, designers, sound engineers, actors. The recruitment process had deliberately, or through the logic of the skills required, drawn heavily from America's creative communities. Several members went on to distinguished post-war careers in art, design, and entertainment. Bill Blass, the fashion designer; Ellsworth Kelly, the painter; Arthur Singer, the illustrator; The unit's composition gave it a character unlike any other formation in the American military, and the work they produced, the simulations, the designs, the performances, reflected a creative sophistication that purely military training would not have generated. This much is now known. The Ghost Army's existence was declassified in 1996, and the unit has received growing public recognition in the decades since. A Congressional Gold Medal, documentary films, books, exhibitions. The broad story has been told, but the records have not been fully opened. The operational files of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the detailed documentation of individual missions, the assessments of what worked and what did not, the intelligence evaluations that measured the unit's effectiveness against German responses, the full accounting of what was simulated, where and with what result, exist in a state of partial availability that has frustrated researchers who want to understand the complete picture. Some of this is straightforward archival incompleteness. The National Archives hold significant material relating to the Ghost Army, and researchers have been able to reconstruct the unit's operational history in considerable detail from what is available. But the reconstruction has gaps. Documents that should exist, after-action reports for specific operations, intelligence assessments that would have been generated in response to the unit's activities, are absent from the files in ways that are not fully explained by simple loss or administrative oversight. The question of what is missing and why it is missing has two broad categories of answer. The first is bureaucratic. The Ghost Army operated under layers of classification that were not always coherently managed. Materials generated by the unit passed through multiple chains of command and multiple classification systems: tactical, operational, and strategic. And the post-war process of declassification and archival organization did not always succeed in locating, consolidating, and releasing everything that the passage of time had rendered no longer sensitive. Files were misfiled. Documents were overlooked. The imperfect processes of institutional memory left gaps that reflect administrative failure rather than deliberate concealment. The second category of answer is more interesting and more difficult to dismiss. The Ghost Army's techniques, particularly its radio deception and signal simulation capabilities, were of continuing relevance beyond the end of the Second World War. The Cold War created immediate and sustained demand for precisely the kind of expertise the unit had developed. The men who had spent years learning to simulate military formations convincingly, to generate false signals traffic that could deceive sophisticated intercept operations, to think carefully about the gap between military appearance and military reality. Those men and that knowledge had obvious applications in the new strategic environment. Several researchers have suggested that the most operationally detailed records of the Ghost Army's methods were not simply filed and forgotten after the war, but were actively retained within the military intelligence and deception apparatus that was being constructed for the Cold War. That the technical documentation of how the deception was achieved, the specific frequencies, the simulation protocols, the assessment of what the enemy believed and why, was classified not for historical reasons but for forward-looking operational ones. That it was kept not in an archive, but in an active file, accessible to planners who intended to use it again. If that is true, it would mean that the missing Ghost Army records are not lost. They are held, maintained in classifications that reflect their continuing operational relevance rather than their historical sensitivity. And the question of when, if ever, they would be released would depend not on the passage of time but on a determination that the methods they document are no longer of use to anyone who might be planning a deception. There is also a dimension of the Ghost Army story that the available records address only obliquely: the question of what the Germans actually believed during the operations, and what decisions they made as a result. The effectiveness of any deception operation is ultimately measured not by what the deceivers did, but by what the deceived thought and how they responded. The German side of the Ghost Army story, the intelligence assessments, the orders issued in response to simulated American formations, the resources diverted and the operations altered because of phantom units, exists in German military records that have been more extensively open than their American counterparts in certain respects, but which have not been systematically cross-referenced with the Ghost Army's operational record in a way that would allow a comprehensive effectiveness assessment. That cross-referencing is possible, in principle. The materials exist on both sides. What has not happened is a coordinated, fully resourced effort to bring the American and German records together in a way that would allow the Ghost Army's actual impact, operation by operation, decision by decision, to be measured with precision. Why that effort has not been made is itself a question worth sitting with. The Ghost Army has been celebrated, recognized, and publicly honored. Its story has entered the popular historical consciousness in ways that would have been unimaginable to the men who served in it under absolute secrecy. And yet the deepest layer of its operational record, the technical specifics, the intelligence assessments, the full measure of what it achieved and how, remains inaccessible. A unit built entirely on the art of making things appear to be what they were not, whose most important records have, somehow, managed to remain invisible. Whether that is coincidence, administrative imperfection, or the final and most enduring performance of the deception that defined them, is a question that the Ghost Army characteristically has left without a clear answer. The Ghost Army built its legacy on the art of controlled appearance, on making the world see what it was directed to see, and withholding what it was not meant to find. There is a certain symmetry, then, in turning from that story to one that involves a different kind of concealment. Not the manufactured illusion of military formations that did not exist, but the deliberate management of a story that did. A story that the American government had every reason to present in the simplest possible terms, and equally strong reasons to ensure that its more complicated dimensions never reached a wider audience. In June of 1942, 2 rubber rafts came ashore on the eastern coastline of the United States. The first landed on a beach near Amagansett, on Long Island, in the early hours of the morning of the 13th of June. The second landed 4 days later on Ponte Vedra Beach, south of Jacksonville, Florida. The men who stepped off those rafts, 8 in total, traveling in 2 groups of 4, had been trained in Germany, transported across the Atlantic by submarine, and inserted onto American soil with a mission that, if successful, would have represented the most significant act of sabotage ever conducted on American territory. They were carrying explosives, incendiary devices, and a target list that included aluminium plants, railway infrastructure, canal locks, and the manufacturing facilities that underpinned the American war economy. They had American money, over $80,000 in cash between them, and American civilian clothing, and years of accumulated knowledge of American cities and customs, because most of them had lived in the United States before the war and understood the country in ways that made them, in theory, far more dangerous than foreign agents operating in an unfamiliar environment. The operation was called Pastorius, after the leader of the first significant German immigrant community in America. The name reflected the ambition of the program, not merely an act of terrorism, but a sustained campaign of economic disruption intended to erode American industrial capacity and public confidence in the safety of the home front. It failed, completely, and very quickly. Within days of the Long Island landing, one of the saboteurs, George Dash, had turned himself in to the FBI. He provided information that led to the rapid arrest of all 8 men. Within weeks, they had been tried by military tribunal. 6 were executed. 2, including Dash, received prison sentences in exchange for their cooperation and were subsequently deported to Germany after the war. This is the official story. It is well documented, widely known, and presented in American historical accounts as a clear and uncomplicated success, a demonstration of the FBI's vigilance and the impossibility of conducting covert operations against a prepared and alert American security apparatus. But the official story has always had edges that careful examination makes difficult to smooth. The most persistent and significant question concerns the FBI's actual role in the discovery of the plot. J. Edgar Hoover presented the arrests as the product of FBI detective work, an active investigation that had tracked and neutralized the threat through the Bureau's operational capabilities. This account served Hoover's institutional interests considerably and has been accepted in broad terms by public accounts of the operation ever since. The problem is that the timeline does not fully support it. Dash arrived in Washington and contacted the FBI on the 19th of June 1942, 6 days after the Long Island landing. He brought with him a handkerchief on which the names and contact details of his fellow saboteurs had been written in invisible ink, and he provided a detailed account of the operation and its personnel to FBI agents. The arrests of the remaining 7 men followed within days of that contact. The uncomfortable implication, raised by historians who have examined the sequence carefully, is that the FBI did not discover the plot. The plot discovered the FBI. Dash walked in and handed the Bureau its victory. The subsequent presentation of the arrests as a triumph of American counterintelligence required a degree of narrative management that left certain questions unasked in the public account. Those questions concern what else Dash provided and what the FBI chose to do with it. Dash had been recruited and trained by German intelligence. He had knowledge not only of Operation Pastorius, but of the broader infrastructure of German intelligence operations targeting the United States, the networks, the methods, the personnel involved in the Abwehr's American programs. An asset of that kind, walking voluntarily into FBI custody with a cooperative disposition, would have been of extraordinary value to American counterintelligence. What Dash told the FBI beyond the immediate details of Pastorius, and what the Bureau did with that information, is documented in files that have been partially released and remain partially classified. The portions that are available confirm that the debriefing was extensive and that Dash's information touched on matters beyond the 8 saboteurs. The portions that remain closed are, by definition, inaccessible. The question of what those closed portions contain has occupied researchers for decades. Several possibilities present themselves, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first concerns the possibility that Dash's information led to the identification and management of additional German intelligence assets operating in the United States. Assets who were not arrested and publicly prosecuted, but were instead turned or monitored in ways that served American counterintelligence interests more effectively than their immediate removal would have. The use of turned agents and controlled networks was a standard feature of Allied counterintelligence in Britain during this period, most famously in the double-cross system. Whether a comparable program operated in the United States, drawing on information provided by sources like Dash, has never been fully confirmed or denied. The second possibility concerns the German side of the operation, specifically the question of who within the Abwehr had authorized and organized Pastorius, and whether the operation's rapid failure reflected not merely Dash's defection, but the possibility that German intelligence had been penetrated at the level where the operation was planned. Operation Pastorius was not a sophisticated operation. The selection and training of the agents, the choice of targets, the insertion method, all reflected a level of planning that experienced intelligence professionals on the Allied side found, even at the time, somewhat crude. Several post-war analyses have suggested that the operation may have been compromised before it began, that Allied intelligence had foreknowledge of the program that allowed them to prepare for its arrival in ways that Hoover's public account did not acknowledge. If that is true, the question of how that foreknowledge was obtained, through signals intelligence, through a penetration of the Abwehr, through a source within the German intelligence apparatus, connects Pastorius to the broader and still partially classified story of Allied intelligence penetration of German operations during the war. There is also a dimension of the story that concerns the saboteurs themselves, specifically, the 2 who were not executed. Dash and his fellow cooperating agent Ernst Berger served their prison sentences and were deported to West Germany in 1948. Dash spent subsequent years attempting, without success, to have his cooperation with the FBI publicly acknowledged in a way that he felt reflected the reality of what he had done. He wrote a memoir. He sought recognition. He died in 1992, in Germany, having never received the acknowledgement he believed he was owed. The FBI's consistent position, that Dash's role was that of a criminal rather than an asset, that his cooperation was a matter of captured necessity rather than voluntary defection, served Hoover's institutional narrative, and has shaped the public record ever since. Whether that position reflects the full truth of what Dash provided and what the Bureau subsequently did with it is something that the classified portions of the Pastorius file might clarify. The National Archives holds material relating to Operation Pastorius that has not been fully released. The FBI's own institutional records on the case have been subject to Freedom of Information requests that have returned heavily redacted documents, redactions that, given the passage of more than 80 years, are difficult to justify on grounds of current operational sensitivity. What remains protected in those redactions, whether it concerns turned agents, intelligence sources, the full scope of Dash's debriefing, or something else entirely, is unknown. 8 men came ashore in the summer of 1942 with explosives and ambitions and a mission that collapsed almost immediately. The official story of their failure is clean and reassuring. But clean and reassuring stories in the history of wartime intelligence are almost always incomplete, and the files that would complicate this one have not yet been opened. The Pastorius files sit in Washington, redacted and partial, protecting secrets whose operational justification expired decades ago. It is a pattern we have encountered repeatedly in this exploration. The classified remainder, the file that should have been opened and has not been, the institutional silence that outlasts any reasonable explanation rooted in current security concerns. But if the American side of wartime intelligence concealment has its unanswered questions, the German side has its own, and some of them connect directly to the story we have just left behind. Operation Pastorius was funded in part with counterfeit American currency. The saboteurs carried forged dollars alongside genuine ones, a detail that appears in the available record almost as a footnote, but which opens into a much larger story. Because the production of counterfeit Allied currency was not an improvised supplement to German intelligence operations. It was a program, a sophisticated, centrally directed, meticulously managed program that operated for years, produced results of extraordinary quality, and was run by a man whose personal files, the detailed operational record of everything he built and everything he knew, vanished at the end of the war and have never been fully recovered. His name was Bernhard Krüger. He was an SS Sturmbannführer, a major in conventional military terms, who had been assigned to the Reich Security Main Office with a specific and unusual brief. Krüger was an engineer by training, a methodical and technically gifted man who understood manufacturing processes with a precision that his superiors recognized as valuable. The task he was given in the early 1940s drew on exactly those qualities. He was placed in charge of what would become Operation Bernhard, the largest and most successful counterfeiting operation in modern history. The program had a clear strategic logic. If German forgers could produce British pounds of sufficient quality to pass in normal commercial circulation, and if those notes could be introduced into the British economy in sufficient quantities, the resulting inflation and loss of confidence in sterling could cause economic disruption that would complement the military pressure of the war. The same logic, extended to dollars, could undermine American financial stability. The ambition was genuine, and the execution was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. To produce notes that could deceive experienced bank tellers and currency experts, Krüger needed workers of exceptional skill. He found them in the concentration camp system, specifically at Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin, where a special block designated Block 19 was established as the operational center of the forgery program. Jewish prisoners with relevant professional backgrounds, printers, engravers, graphic designers, bank employees who understood currency intimately, were selected from the camp population and transferred to Block 19 under conditions that were, relative to the general Sachsenhausen population, somewhat less immediately lethal. They were kept alive because they were useful. The work they were forced to produce would eventually be dumped into Lake Toplitz, a connection we encountered earlier in this story, in the final weeks of the war. But the work itself, under Krüger's direction, achieved something remarkable. The forged British pounds that Operation Bernhard produced were, by the assessment of the Bank of England's own experts after the war, of a quality that made reliable detection extremely difficult. Millions of pounds worth were produced and distributed through various channels, some through neutral countries, some through intelligence operations, some directly into circulation through means that have not been fully traced. The economic impact was real, if ultimately insufficient to achieve the program's strategic objectives. Then came 1945, and with it, the question of what happened to Krüger's files. The operational records of a program like Bernhard would have been extensive. Technical documentation of the production process, the paper formulations, the ink compositions, the printing specifications that had been developed through years of painstaking trial and error to produce notes that defeated expert scrutiny. Personnel records of the prisoners who worked in Block 19, the SS staff who managed the operation, the intelligence officers who handled the distribution of the forged notes, financial records of the program's output, how many notes were produced, in what denominations, through which channels they were distributed, and what became of the proceeds of any that were successfully exchanged for genuine currency or goods. Distribution records, in particular, would have been of extraordinary value to post-war investigators. The network through which Operation Bernhard's output reached circulation, the agents, intermediaries, and financial institutions that handled forged currency, touched legitimate financial systems in neutral countries in ways that those countries had strong post-war incentives to conceal. The Swiss banking sector in particular had a relationship with wartime German financial operations that post-war accountability never fully examined, and the Bernhard distribution network was one of the threads that connected German intelligence money to Swiss financial infrastructure. Krüger himself survived the war. He was captured, interrogated, and eventually released. In the immediate post-war years, he gave accounts of the operation to Allied investigators that were detailed enough to establish the broad outlines of what Bernhard had achieved, but carefully incomplete in ways that protected the most sensitive dimensions of what he knew. He was never prosecuted. He returned to civilian life in West Germany, working in the textile industry, and died in 1989. What he chose not to tell his interrogators, and what his personal files, if they survived, might have contained, is the central question. The technical documentation of the counterfeiting process is the element most frequently discussed, partly because of its obvious continuing relevance. A process that had defeated the Bank of England's detection capabilities was not something that intelligence services in the post-war world, entering a Cold War that would make covert financial operations an important instrument of statecraft, would simply discard. The possibility that Krüger's technical files were retained by German intelligence veterans who understood their value, by Allied intelligence officers who recognized the same thing, or by some combination of both, operating through the murky networks of post-war intelligence recycling, has been raised by researchers without being resolved. But the distribution records may ultimately be the more historically significant loss. The network that handled the output of Operation Bernhard was not composed exclusively of wartime enemies of the Allies. It included individuals and institutions in neutral and friendly countries whose participation in the movement of forged Allied currency represented a form of collaboration with German intelligence operations that the post-war order had every reason to overlook. Names that appeared in Krüger's distribution files would have been, in many cases, names that also appeared in the post-war financial and political structures of Western Europe. The incentives for making those files disappear were, in other words, not exclusively German. Several researchers who have pursued the Bernhard documentation have noted that the gaps in the available record are not randomly distributed. The technical production files, which would have been of military and intelligence value, are absent. The distribution records, which would have been of political and financial sensitivity, are absent. The personnel records of the SS staff involved in the operation, which would have identified individuals who subsequently rebuilt lives under new or unchanged identities, are incomplete. The pattern of absence suggests selection rather than accident, a curation of what was destroyed and what was preserved that reflects someone's judgment about what needed to remain hidden. Krüger's own role in that curation is unknown. He was an intelligent and careful man who had spent years managing a program of extraordinary sensitivity. the possibility that he entered Allied custody with a considered view of what he would disclose and what he would protect, and that his subsequent release reflected in part a transaction in which that protected knowledge was the currency, is consistent with the pattern of post-war intelligence recycling that appears elsewhere in this story. What he carried out of the war, and where it went, has never been established. The Bank of England, for its part, has never published a complete accounting of how many Bernhard forgeries entered genuine circulation, through which channels, or what the full financial impact of the program was. Some of that reticence reflects legitimate institutional caution about disclosing information that could assist future counterfeiters. Some of it, researchers have suggested, reflects a more specific sensitivity about what a complete accounting would reveal about the institutions and individuals who handled forged currency in ways that implicated them in German intelligence operations. The files of Bernhard Krüger, if they survive, if they were preserved, if they are held somewhere in the classified holdings of an intelligence service that understood their value, would answer questions that several governments, several financial institutions, and several national histories have spent 8 decades carefully not asking, and the fact that they have not surfaced may itself be the most informative thing about them. Bernhard Krüger's files disappeared into the same institutional silence that swallowed so many of the war's most sensitive records, absorbed by intelligence services that understood their value, protected by governments that had reasons to manage rather than expose what they contained. The thread connecting counterfeiting operations, distribution networks, and the post-war financial architecture of Western Europe remains, as we have seen, deliberately incomplete. But as we move deeper into this exploration, a pattern becomes visible that transcends individual mysteries. Across occupied Europe, in territory after territory, the retreating Reich left behind not just the ruins of its military ambitions, but the physical evidence of something more systematic, a program of underground construction so extensive, so expensive, and so deliberately obscured that its full dimensions are still being mapped decades after the war that built it ended. We have already visited Jonastal in Thuringia, where tunnel complexes of uncertain purpose sit beneath forested hills, their sealed sections unexamined. We have been beneath Książ Castle in Lower Silesia, where SS construction reached deep into the earth under conditions of absolute secrecy. Now we turn to a different part of the former Reich's territory, to a landscape further west, closer to the original borders of Germany, where a tunnel system of considerable scale has accumulated its own history of incomplete investigation and unanswered questions. The Hindenburg tunnels are located in the Eifel region of western Germany, near the Belgian border. A landscape of volcanic hills, dark forests, and deep valleys that has been strategically significant since the Roman period. The tunnels themselves are not a single unified complex, but a network of passages, chambers, and connecting infrastructure built into the hillsides of the region during the Second World War, extending across an area that researchers have found consistently difficult to map with completeness. The name carries historical weight of its own. The Hindenburg Line, the defensive fortifications of the First World War, ran through broadly this region of Western Europe, and the landscape had been militarized and tunneled in earlier conflicts in ways that provided both precedent and, in some cases, physical foundations for the work carried out under the Third Reich. The continuity of military engineering across generations of German conflict is one of the complicating factors in understanding what was built here and when. What is documented, in broad terms, is that significant tunnel construction was conducted in the Eifel region during the Nazi period, carried out under conditions of secrecy and using forced labor drawn from the camp system. The strategic logic for underground infrastructure in this area was real. It was within range of Allied bombing from British bases. It was close to the Western Front that would become the theater of the 1944-45 campaigns, and it sat astride supply and communication routes whose protection the Wehrmacht considered essential. The tunnels served multiple confirmed purposes: command and communication facilities, fuel and ammunition storage, shelter for military equipment and personnel from aerial attack. These are the mundane, documented functions, uncontroversial in themselves and consistent with the general pattern of German underground construction throughout the war. But the Eiffel Tunnel network is larger than those functions alone would seem to require, considerably larger in the assessment of researchers who have attempted to survey the system systematically. The passages extend further, branch more extensively, and include chambers of a scale and specification that exceed what fuel storage or command facilities would demand. And the portions of the network that exceed the documented military functions are, with a consistency that researchers have noted repeatedly, the portions that remain least accessible and least investigated. Part of what makes the Eiffel tunnels particularly interesting is their geographic relationship to specific events in the final phase of the European War. The region was the staging ground for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes Offensive of December 1944, known in Western accounts as the Battle of the Bulge. The last major German offensive in the West was planned, supplied, and launched from this landscape. The tunnel infrastructure of the Eifel region played a direct role in that operation, providing the concealment and protection that allowed the Wehrmacht to assemble a significant attacking force without Allied aerial reconnaissance detecting its concentration. The Ardennes offensive failed. The German forces that had been assembled with such care and concealed with such sophistication were pushed back at enormous cost to both sides, and the subsequent Allied advance swept through the Eifel region in the early months of 1945. What Allied forces found in the tunnel networks they encountered has been documented only partially. The pace of the advance, the priority of continuing westward momentum, and the sheer scale of the infrastructure they were encountering left little time for thorough investigation. What was left behind in the tunnels, and what was removed before Allied forces arrived, is a question that post-war investigators return to repeatedly without fully resolving. The connection to the broader pattern of late-war concealment operations is significant here. The Eifel region was not geographically remote from the financial and administrative centers of the Reich. It was, in the final analysis, part of the German homeland, a landscape whose tunnels and bunkers were among the last secure spaces available to an organization that was running out of options and running out of time. The same weeks that saw frantic asset transfers in the east, the loading of ships in Baltic ports, and the burning of archives and castles across occupied Europe also saw activity in the tunnel networks of Western Germany that has not been comprehensively documented. Accounts from local residents, accumulated over decades, filtered through the distortions of memory and the particular pressures of the post-war period in a defeated country, speak of activity in the Eiffel Tunnel network in the weeks before American forces arrived that goes beyond the evacuation of standard military materials. The specifics vary. The consistent thread is of vehicles arriving at tunnel entrances after dark, of materials being moved inward rather than outward, of entrances being sealed by personnel who understood they would not be returning. The physical evidence on the ground is ambiguous in the way that physical evidence from this period characteristically is. Some tunnel sections show signs of deliberate closure, blockages that are not consistent with structural collapse and that appear on examination to have been engineered. Whether those closures were implemented to prevent Allied access to material still inside, or simply as standard military denial procedures for infrastructure that could not be evacuated, cannot be determined without opening them. Several amateur investigators and local historians have spent years attempting to map the full extent of the Eiffel Tunnel network, working from a combination of archival research, aerial survey data, and ground inspection. Their collective work has established that the network is substantially more extensive than official documentation acknowledges. It has also established that certain sections identified through archival or aerial evidence do not appear in any official record of investigated or cleared tunnel infrastructure, meaning there are passages that are known to exist, at least in general terms, but that no post-war authority has formally examined and documented. The German federal and state authorities responsible for the region have, over the years, addressed questions about the tunnel network with responses that range from genuinely helpful to evasive in ways that researchers have found difficult to interpret. Safety concerns, structural instability, residual unexploded ordnance, the genuine hazards of unventilated underground spaces, are cited regularly, and some of those concerns are entirely legitimate. Whether they are also, in some cases, convenient is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. What the Eiffel tunnels represent, in the broader context of this exploration, is the accumulation of a very large number of small, unresolved questions into something that begins to feel like a significant gap. No single tunnel section, no single account, no single archival absence constitutes a compelling mystery on its own. But the pattern of infrastructure exceeding documented purpose, of sealed sections never formally investigated, of local accounts pointing toward late war activity that official records do not reflect, of a landscape that was strategically central to the war's final Western phase and yet incompletely examined in its aftermath, adds up to something that the available record does not satisfactorily explain. The Eiffel Hills are quiet now. The forests have grown back over the scars of construction and conflict. The entrances to many tunnel sections are overgrown or sealed or simply absent from any map that a member of the public can access. Beneath the surface, in the darkness that has persisted since the war's final winter, whatever was placed there either remains or was removed by hands that left no record of the removal. Both possibilities are, in their own way, unsettling, and which of them is true has never, in this landscape as in so many others, been definitively established. The Eiffel tunnels hold their silence beneath forests that have grown back slowly over the wounds of construction and conflict. Whatever was placed in those sealed passages, whether it remains or was removed in the quiet years since, has not announced itself. And there is something appropriate, perhaps, in ending our time in that underground landscape and moving eastward to the place where the Third Reich's story reached its most concentrated and most contested conclusion. Because if the tunnel networks of Western Germany represent the mystery of what was hidden and never recovered, the ruins of central Berlin represent something different. The mystery of what happened in plain sight, witnessed by thousands, and still not fully understood. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was dying. The Soviet encirclement of the city tightened through April with a methodical, devastating thoroughness. Artillery fire was continuous. The streets above the government district had become a landscape of rubble, fire, and the particular horror of urban combat conducted among the ruins of a capital city. And beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, in a complex of underground rooms that had been constructed to protect the leadership of the Reich from precisely this kind of aerial and artillery bombardment, Adolf Hitler spent the final days of his life. The Führer Bunker. Its name has become one of the most recognizable words associated with the war's end, a byword for the particular psychology of a regime consuming itself in its final hours. The events that unfolded there in the last days of April 1945 have been reconstructed from testimony, from physical evidence, and from the Soviet investigation that followed the capture of the site. The broad outlines are not seriously disputed by mainstream historians. Hitler died on the 30th of April. Eva Braun died with him. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden, incompletely, and the remains were subsequently found by Soviet forces. But around the edges of that central account, in the details, in the physical evidence, in the bodies that were found in and around the bunker complex that have never been fully identified, there are questions that the official record addresses with less confidence than the central narrative suggests. The Soviet forces that entered the Führer bunker in the first days of May 1945 found it in a state of considerable disorder. The final days of occupation had left the complex littered with documents, personal effects, and the physical detritus of a community that had disintegrated rapidly and chaotically. Among what they found were bodies, not only the partially burned remains in the garden, but other individuals whose presence in the bunker complex and whose identities presented immediate questions. Some of those questions were answered relatively quickly. The Goebbels family, Joseph, Magda, and their 6 children, were identified. Senior SS personnel who had died in the complex or its immediate vicinity were accounted for. The chain of identification, while not without its complications, produced a roster of named individuals whose fates were established to a reasonable degree of confidence. but not all of the bodies found in and around the bunker complex were identified. Several individuals, the precise number varies across different Soviet investigative accounts, were found in locations and circumstances that did not clearly place them within the known roster of bunker occupants. Who they were, why they were there, and what their presence suggested about the final hours of the Reich's leadership remains, in certain cases, unresolved. The Soviet investigation of the bunker site was conducted under conditions that did not prioritize the kind of forensic thoroughness that the questions deserved. The political imperatives of the moment, establishing definitively that Hitler was dead, producing evidence that would close the question for the Soviet leadership and for Stalin personally, shaped the investigation in ways that left secondary questions incompletely addressed. Materials were removed. Remains were transported east. The site itself was altered, deliberately and incidentally, by the activities of the forces occupying it. What the Soviets concluded, and what evidence they based those conclusions on, was not fully shared with Western Allied authorities. The division of Berlin and the subsequent Cold War created a situation in which the physical evidence of the bunker's final days sat within Soviet-controlled territory, accessible only on Soviet terms, interpreted through Soviet investigative frameworks whose assumptions and methods were not subject to independent verification. This matters because the questions surrounding the bunker extend beyond the identification of unknown bodies. They touch on the central and most contested question of the entire episode, the question of Hitler's death itself. The official account is clear. Hitler shot himself on the afternoon of the 30th of April. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were burned in the garden. The Soviet investigation found remains consistent with this account. Western historians, drawing on the testimonies of bunker survivors and the physical evidence available, have concluded that the death occurred as described. And yet the doubts have persisted. Not, it should be said, among serious historians who have examined the evidence carefully, but in a broader cultural and investigative space that has kept the question alive for 8 decades. Some of that persistence is the product of genuine evidentiary gaps. Some reflects the particular psychology of historical events so dramatic that straightforward explanations feel insufficient. And some, a smaller but not negligible portion, reflects legitimate questions about the completeness and reliability of the Soviet investigation that forms the primary physical basis of the official account. The skull fragment that Soviet authorities long presented as evidence of Hitler's death, a piece of bone with a bullet hole, held in Moscow archives, was subjected to DNA analysis in 2018, conducted by American researchers who obtained access to the material. The results were striking. The DNA profile from the fragment was consistent with a woman between the ages of 40 and 60, not with Hitler. The fragment, in other words, was almost certainly not his. The Soviet and subsequently Russian response to this finding has been measured and largely dismissive, suggesting that the fragment in question may have been mislabeled or misidentified within the archive, and that its evidential status was less central to the identification than had sometimes been presented. This may well be accurate. The death account rests on more than a single bone fragment, but the episode illustrates a broader problem. The physical evidence from the bunker was collected, transported, and curated by a single party, Soviet intelligence, under conditions that combine genuine investigative urgency with powerful political motivations, and the results of that curation have never been subject to fully independent examination. The chain of custody for the remains is not what forensic standards would require. In the absence of that certainty, the unidentified bodies found near the bunker carry a weight that exceeds their individual significance. Each unidentified individual is a gap in the roster, a person whose presence in that specific location at that specific moment has not been explained. In the chaos of the final days, with hundreds of people moving through the bunker complex and its connected tunnel network in various states of authority, desperation, and purpose, unidentified bodies are not inherently suspicious. People died in the ruins of Berlin by the thousands in those days. But the bunker was not a random location. It was the most controlled, most surveilled, most carefully managed space in what remained of the Reich. The people who were there for reasons. Their identities, their roles, and their fates were matters of significance, not only historically, but operationally, in terms of understanding what happened in those final hours and what, if anything, was set in motion before the end came. Some of the bunker's occupants escaped. The breakout attempts of the final days dispersed people into the burning city, and some of those people survived, resurfaced elsewhere, and eventually gave accounts of what they had witnessed. Others did not survive and were never formally identified. The line between those two categories, between the people who disappeared into the ruins of Berlin and the bodies that were found and not identified, is not drawn with the precision that a complete historical account would require. In the basement rooms below the Chancellery Garden, in the final hours of a regime that had shaped the world for 12 years, something ended. And something, the full, verified, independently confirmed account of exactly how and exactly who, has not yet been completely told. The bodies that were never identified remain in the record as absences, and absences in the history of the Third Reich's final days have a way of refusing to stay quiet. The bunker beneath the Chancellery Garden holds its unresolved questions in the foundation of a reunified city that is built carefully and deliberately over the ruins of its most difficult history. The absences in the roster of the identified, the gaps in the Soviet investigative record, the skull fragment that turned out not to be what it was presented as. These are mysteries rooted in the most concentrated point of the Reich's collapse, in a space so charged with historical significance that every unanswered question carries an outsized weight. But we have been moving throughout this exploration between the intimate and the oceanic, between sealed rooms and open seas, between the specific and the vast. And the ocean, as we have seen repeatedly, holds its own category of wartime mystery with a patience and a thoroughness that no archive can match. We return to it now, not to the Baltic or the South Atlantic or the Pacific, but to the North Atlantic, to the waters that were, for the duration of the war, the most contested maritime space on Earth, the hunting ground of the U-boat war, the route along which the Allied war effort was sustained, convoy by convoy, through years of attrition that came closer to deciding the outcome of the conflict than most post-war accounts acknowledge. In February of 1941, a British cargo vessel called the SS Gairsoppa was making its way northward through those waters, bound for Britain from India. It had departed Calcutta months earlier, carrying a cargo that reflected the enormous logistical reach of the British imperial system: tea, pig iron, and silver. A great deal of silver. The precise quantity has been a matter of some discussion over the years, but the most carefully researched estimates place the silver content of the Gairsoppa's cargo at approximately 240 tons, one of the largest single consignments of the metal ever carried on a single vessel. The silver was not decorative. It was strategic. Britain in 1941 was under financial pressures of extraordinary severity. The cost of the war was consuming the country's reserves at a rate that threatened the entire basis of the war effort, and silver, alongside gold, was one of the instruments through which those pressures were being managed. The movement of precious metals from India to Britain was part of a broader financial architecture that sustained Allied resistance during the period before American entry into the war, transformed the strategic equation. The Gairsoppa never delivered its cargo. On the 17th of February 1941, the vessel was located by a German U-boat approximately 300 miles southwest of Ireland. A single torpedo was sufficient. The ship sank quickly in water of approximately 4,700 meters depth, nearly 3 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic. Of the 85 people aboard, only one survived. The rest went down with the ship or perished in the conditions of the North Atlantic in February, which allowed little time for survival, even for those who reached the water. The wreck settled on the seabed and remained there, largely undisturbed, for 7 decades. Then, in 2011, an American deep-sea salvage company called Odyssey Marine Exploration located the Gairsoppa. The discovery was significant not merely historically, but commercially. The silver cargo, at the market prices prevailing in 2011, represented a recovery opportunity worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Odyssey had entered into a contract with the British government, which retained ownership of the vessel and its cargo, to conduct salvage operations in exchange for a share of what was recovered. What followed was a salvage operation of considerable technical sophistication, conducted over multiple seasons in conditions of significant difficulty. The depth of the wreck, nearly 3 miles, placed it at the outer limits of remotely operated vehicle capability. The Atlantic weather created operational windows that were limited and unpredictable, and the cargo, after 70 years on the seabed, had been affected by the pressure, the cold, and the slow chemistry of deep water preservation in ways that complicated its recovery. The salvage recovered silver, a significant quantity. The official figures released by Odyssey and the British government confirmed recoveries running into the tens of millions of dollars in value, representing a substantial portion of the documented cargo. A portion. Not all of it. The question of what was not recovered, and why, is where the documented history of the Gairsoppa begins to develop its own unanswered dimension. The official position is straightforward. The salvage recovered what was accessible, and the remainder of the cargo is either too deeply buried within the wrecked structure, too dispersed across the seabed around the impact site, or too damaged by decades of immersion to be practically recoverable. This is a reasonable position. Deep water salvage is not a process that can achieve complete recovery, and the conditions of the Gairsoppa wreck, a vessel that sank rapidly after torpedo damage, settling on an uneven seabed at extreme depth, would have distributed its cargo in ways that make comprehensive retrieval technically and economically unfeasible. But the discrepancy between the documented cargo and the recovered cargo is not trivial. The gap between 240 tons of silver and what was actually brought to the surface is substantial enough to sustain questions that go beyond straightforward salvage incompleteness. Some researchers have raised the possibility that the Gairsoppa's documented manifest did not reflect its complete cargo. The vessel was operating in wartime conditions, under regulations that prioritized security over transparency, and the movement of strategic metals was handled through channels that did not always generate the kind of comprehensive paper trail that peacetime commercial shipping would produce. The silver that appeared on official manifests may not have been the totality of what the ship was carrying. This is not an unusual observation in the context of wartime British shipping. The exigencies of the war effort, combined with the financial pressures that Britain was managing in the early war years, created conditions in which the movement of assets was sometimes deliberately obscured. For security reasons, for financial management reasons, or for reasons that touched on the complex relationships between British imperial financial systems and the institutional structures that governed them. Whether the Gairsoppa was carrying materials beyond its documented manifest, and if so, what category of materials, cannot be established from the available record. The British government files relating to the vessel's final cargo have been released in forms that satisfy the basic requirements of historical transparency without necessarily capturing every dimension of what was loaded in Calcutta before the final voyage began. There is also the question of the salvage operation itself, specifically, the completeness of the disclosure around what was recovered. Odyssey Marine Exploration operated under a contract with the British government that specified the terms of recovery and disclosure, and the publicly reported figures represent the official account of what the operation achieved. Whether that official account encompasses everything that was brought to the surface, or whether the recovery process generated findings that were handled outside the public reporting framework, is something that independent researchers cannot verify from the available record. Deep-sea salvage operations of this kind are conducted in conditions of considerable physical remoteness. The practical oversight of what is recovered, cataloged and reported from a work site 3 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, is limited in ways that have no real parallel in land-based archaeological or recovery operations. The trust placed in the operating company and its contractual relationship with the government is, of necessity, substantial. Whether that trust was fully warranted, whether the Gairsoppa's final accounting, as presented to the public, represents a complete picture of what the North Atlantic gave back, is a question that the structure of the operation makes difficult to answer with confidence. The wreck remains on the seabed. The portions of the cargo that were not recovered are still there, or were never there to begin with, or departed the site through channels that the official record does not reflect. 3 miles of dark water and institutional opacity combine, as they so often do in these stories, to produce a space in which certainty is impossible and the questions persist. A ship loaded with strategic silver in the last months before the war's financial equation changed forever. Sunk in the most contested waters on Earth. Recovered, partially, 7 decades later under commercial conditions that limited independent oversight. And the gap between what was documented and what was returned has never been closed to everyone's satisfaction. The North Atlantic keeps its arithmetic quietly. The gap between what the Gairsoppa loaded and what was recovered sitting in the record like an unfinished equation, neither provably explained nor provably suspicious, occupying that uncomfortable middle ground that characterizes so many of the mysteries in this exploration. We have moved, across the course of this story, through sunken ships and sealed tunnels and burned archives and classified files, through every category of concealment that a world at war found available to it. But there is one category we have not yet examined directly, one that operated not in the depths of oceans or the darkness of underground chambers, but on the surface of the land itself, in forests, in farmhouses, in the ordinary landscape of a defeated country, among a civilian population that was being asked, by the last desperate voices of a collapsing regime, to become invisible weapons. In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces crossed the borders of Germany from the west and Soviet forces pressed in from the east, Heinrich Himmler announced the formation of a new organization. It was called Werwolf, the German spelling of werewolf, chosen deliberately for its folkloric resonance, its suggestion of something that changed shape, that moved at night, that could not be easily identified or destroyed because it did not present a conventional military profile. The concept was straightforward in its outline, if enormously complex in its execution. As Germany was overrun, specially trained SS and Hitler Youth personnel would remain behind enemy lines, blending into the civilian population, hiding in prepared forest camps, operating from caches of weapons and supplies that had been buried across the Reich's territory in advance of the Allied advance. They would conduct sabotage. They would assassinate occupation officials and German collaborators. They would maintain a state of insecurity and resistance that would make the occupation of Germany costly and perhaps unsustainable. It was, in its ambition, one of the most extensive partisan warfare programs ever conceived by a modern state. In practice, Werwolf's operational record was considerably more modest than its conception suggested. The authenticated acts of sabotage and assassination attributable to organized werewolf units are relatively few. The most notorious confirmed action, the assassination of the American-appointed mayor of Aachen, Franz Oppenhoff, in March 1945, demonstrated that the organization had operational capability, but also exposed its limitations. The killing of a single local official, however symbolically charged, was far from the sustained insurgency that Himmler had envisioned. The gap between the program's ambition and its documented achievements has generated 2 very different historical interpretations. The first, and most widely accepted among mainstream historians, is that Werwolf essentially failed. The organizational infrastructure was inadequate. The training was rushed. The German population, exhausted by years of war and aware that further resistance would only prolong suffering, did not provide the support network that a successful partisan movement requires. The Allied occupation, while sometimes harsh, moved quickly enough and with sufficient control to prevent the kind of sustained insurgency that Werwolf's planners had imagined. The program collapsed of its own weight, its personnel surrendering, dispersing, or simply abandoning their missions in the first weeks and months after the war's end. The second interpretation is more cautious about the completeness of that account. It does not claim that Werwolf succeeded militarily. It asks instead whether the failure of the overt program was accompanied by the success of something more covert, whether the Werwolf infrastructure, even as it collapsed as an active resistance organization, served a different and longer-term purpose, whether the caches, the networks, the trained personnel, and the organizational framework that had been constructed were repurposed rather than abandoned. Whether Werwolf, in other words, became something else. This is where the missing records become central. The documentation of the Werwolf program, the planning files, the personnel rosters, the locations of prepared supply caches, the communication networks and contact protocols, the full organizational structure of what had been conceived as a nationwide underground resistance, was among the most sensitive material in the Reich's possession in the final weeks of the war. It contained the names of every individual who had been recruited, trained, and positioned for post-war underground activity. It contained the locations of buried weapons, explosives, and supplies across the territory of Germany and the occupied territories. It contained the contact networks and identification systems through which Werwolf personnel would recognize each other and communicate after the conventional structures of the Reich had ceased to function. That documentation has never been found in anything approaching completeness. The partial records that did fall into Allied hands, captured in the general sweep of German military and administrative documentation that the Allied intelligence services conducted after the surrender, provided enough information to confirm the program's existence and broad outlines, and to support the investigation and arrest of some of its personnel. They did not provide a comprehensive accounting. The most sensitive operational documentation, the full personnel lists, the complete cache locations, the long-term communication protocols, was either destroyed before capture or was never in the locations where Allied forces looked. The question of which of those explanations is correct has significant implications. If the Werwolf operational records were destroyed, the program effectively ended with the Reich that created it. Its personnel lists burned, its cache locations lost, its communication networks severed. This is the conclusion that the official historical record tends toward, and it is consistent with the broader pattern of German document destruction in the war's final weeks. If the records were not destroyed but removed, carried out of Germany through the same channels that moved other sensitive SS materials in that period, the implications are considerably more complex. A complete Werwolf personnel list and cache location register in the hands of former SS leadership operating through post-war underground networks would have represented an extraordinary organizational asset. The ability to locate, contact, and activate personnel who had been trained for exactly this kind of clandestine post-war activity, using supply caches that had been professionally prepared and concealed, was precisely the kind of capability that post-war ratline organizations and their supporters would have considered valuable. Several researchers who have studied the Werwolf program and its aftermath have concluded that the transition from wartime resistance organization to post-war underground network was more deliberate and more organized than the official account of Werwolf's failure suggests. They point to the activities of Odessa and similar organizations. The post-war SS veteran networks that facilitated escape, provided false documentation, and maintained connections among former Reich personnel, as evidence that the infrastructure for sustained underground activity survived the military defeat. Whether the Werwolf records survived as part of that infrastructure, or whether they were destroyed and the post-war networks operated from memory and personal connection rather than preserved documentation, is not established. What is established is that the weapons caches prepared for Werwolf operations were buried across an enormous area of European territory, Germany, Austria, and the former occupied territories, in numbers and locations that have never been fully mapped. Decades after the war, buried caches of weapons, explosives, and equipment attributable to late-war German stay-behind preparations have been discovered periodically by construction workers, farmers, and accident across Central Europe. Each discovery is a confirmation that the physical infrastructure of the program was more extensive than the surviving documentation reflects. Each undiscovered cache is, by definition, unknown, its contents preserved in whatever condition the decades and the soil have allowed, its location known only to whoever buried it and whoever, if anyone, was given that information. The organizational records that would allow a systematic location and clearance of those caches, that would answer the question of how many there were, where they were placed, and what they contained, are absent from every archive that has been examined. Whether that absence reflects destruction, removal, or simply the incomplete nature of a program that was never fully implemented, the practical consequence is the same. Somewhere in the soil of Central Europe, in forests and fields and hillsides that have seen 8 decades of ordinary life pass over them, there are buried materials from a program that was designed from its inception to be invisible. And the records that would tell us where to look are among the things that never came out of the war.